Well, we have here today Evelyn Berenson. Thank you, who's agreed very graciously to do an oral history for the Computer History Museum. Thank you very much, Evelyn.
It's a pleasure.
Good. I think what I'd like to start out with, could you give us some family background? I'd be interested in your parents, where they came from, what they did, and maybe your earliest memories, and whether you had any siblings, things like that.
Okay. My parents came from Russia in 1905. They were immigrants. I'm a first-generation American, and they came in. My mother's family came in batches. That is, her father and sister went first. When they got some money, the next kid came, and the next kid. There were 9 of them.
Oh, wow.
And they eventually all ended up on the Lower East Side, where all of the Jews of New York were living at that time.
Okay.
Or just about. Anyway, they got married in 1917 and moved up to the Bronx into an apartment in which my parents lived forever, and I lived for about 23 years. So I was born in, my father, I should tell you, but my father was a furrier, a fur cutter. That is, he cut the fur for mink coats, which required a great deal of expertise, which he learned as a boy in Russia. Neither of my parents really ever went to an ordinary school. My father went to what was called cheder, which was essentially a school to learn the Jewish religion, with very little, maybe some addition or whatever, very little else, learning very little else, and my mother never went to school at all. I think there was somebody who came in who taught her to write Yiddish, which was the language they spoke. They knew Russian, but never taught it to us because they used it as their secret language against us. I have 2 brothers, and the oldest brother was 7 years older than I was, and my second brother was 5 years older, and I was born in 1925. So you don't have to add anything. In a few weeks, I will be 89. It's a great age. And it startles me every time I think about it, because it's almost impossible for me to believe. But it's true. So I was born in the Bronx, in a district that was about a mile from the great zoo that lives in the Bronx Zoo, lives there, and the zoo was a place I almost grew up in, and the Bronx River and that whole area, which was really, in those days, a reasonably nice neighborhood, although very, very poor. And by the time I was old enough to understand things, say 5 or 6, I realized I figured this out later, at one time, comparatively recently. We had 6 people living in that apartment, and I figured out how big it was. I have a drawing of it, and it was 420 square feet, 420 square feet into which 6 of us lived. And I never noticed that we were crowded at all. I mean, it never occurred to me. So,
wow.
And I think it never occurred to any of us. My mother told me that when they moved to the Lower East Side, they all lived, 9 of them, 9 children and 2 boarders, and 2 parents. So that's 13 people. And they lived on the 5th floor with the bathroom in the back of the house. So you had to run down 5 flights of stairs and run up flights of stairs to go to the bathroom.
Oh my goodness.
And the bathtub was in the kitchen next to the sink, which is the way all Lower East Side families lived. So when my mother got married and moved to the Bronx, she said her mother came up to visit her in the apartment, walked in and said, "This is a palace." So,
wow.
So I'm giving you the idea
Yes.
of what they came from.
Yes.
My father's parents, actually, he grew up on a graveyard because his father was the person who took care of the graveyard, and therefore made sure that everything was okay. I'll tell you also that it was a blessing because it was just outside of the little village they lived in. And during the Second World War, it was so far outside that when the Nazis came into the village and gathered everybody up, and this was a little Jewish village, they gathered everybody up, brought them to the central town area, made them dig a hole, and killed them all and threw them into the hole. And my aunt, my father's sister, who was still living in the graveyard, her father had died, got away.
Wow.
Because she was outside of the village, so it was a blessing.
Wow.
And she survived the war, which not many Jews did.
Yeah.
So that. I think that gives you an idea. It was a typical, immigrant family.
Mm-hmm.
And I started by going to PS 6, and I think that was probably about 1930. So I entered school at the same time as the Depression entered the country, and it was particularly hard on people like that. The way people worked then, I'll tell you one other story. My father told me that when he first came to this country, he worked 6 days a week, 13 hours a day. That was the regular work time. And it was only after the unions got in and changed the way people were able to, change the relationship between the people who ran the various fur businesses, and that they eventually got down to an 8-hour day. I think by the time I was knowing enough, and he was working 8 hours a day. That was by the early 1930s. So it made a substantial difference. I don't know if there's anything else you want to know about my family?
Talk to me about your school experiences.
Okay. I went to school at a local public school, PS 6, which had a great many kids in it, and the classes were very large. I remember they were probably 40 kids in a class, so 45. I don't think it hurt at all. Everybody was reasonably well behaved. I was one of the people who was always in trouble because I talked too much in class. I had a very good friend, and the two of us were the tallest women in class. We were as tall as most of the taller boys. So we used to giggle a great deal. But they had a plan then. I think it worked very well. Very different from the way kids go to school now. You had to, if there was any noise, you had to put your hands on your head. You had to be in lines and walk in lines, graduated by height. I was always at the end, and you had to do what you were told. And the schools had tests every week and constant reminders that you were required to do some work at home. And I'm saying that from a fairly early age.
Mm-hmm.
They had a system where there were 3 grades. I may be going into too much detail, and you tell me if you think so.
Right.
There were 3 grades. The smartest kids were in the same
at the same grade level.
At the same grade level. It was a 1 class, so you'd be in 2-1 would be second grade, and then the in the class 1, and then two was the most stupid kids, and 3 was the middle kids.
Okay.
So there were 3 classes in each grade, and there were about 40 kids in a class up to the 6th grade, and after that you went to what was it called? Junior high.
Yes.
Junior high. Yeah, it was called junior high. They skipped people. If you were in class 1 and you were all of class 1 skipped. I got out of high school, and then I'll tell you that, but I got out of high school at 15, which was not uncommon then. In other words, what they did was they compressed some class. The 1 classes were compressed so that you did, say, 2nd and 3rd grade together, and you did, I think, 4th and 5th grade together, and 5th and 6th grade together, etc., something like that. But you ended up having taken several years out of your school, and you ended up. I think I had started a little early. Probably started. My birthday is April 12th, and I probably started before I was the right age, quite. So that's why I ended up at 15 in high school. And so they compressed it in the early grades, and then you went into junior high, which is essentially was a compression of 3 years into 2 years.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
And then you went to high school, which was classic, and it was only a 3-year school since you had gotten to the first year in the junior high.
Ah, so you started in what is basically 10th grade today.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you went for only 3 years.
All right.
I went to PS6, from there to junior high school. I just remember the number 44, PS 44. And then I went to an all-girls school. They had them then, called Walton High School, which was on the other side of the Bronx where I was living. Long ride. A new school opened the first year we were in Walton High. It was opening after that first year, called Christopher Columbus in the Bronx. And I think it's important to note because it was new. Everybody in it was young. And because it was the Depression, my teacher in mathematics had a PhD from Princeton, I think.
Oh my goodness.
My teacher in physics, which we had in high school,
Yes.
had a PhD from Chicago.
Oh wow.
And so on. They were all PhDs. They were all highly educated. They were all young, in their 20s.
Yes.
And with a great enthusiasm.
Any job they could get.
Any job they could get. And that was, teaching was a very good job in those days. I think they made something like $2,500 or something.
Okay.
And in the Depression, that was a fine salary. Everybody had a house in either the Hamptons or in Cape Cod. So it was a good job. And women could get work there, which was very difficult to do. My mother, when I got to be a little older, went to work. She hadn't worked before then, but she went to work. And this was, again, the Depression. It was hard to live. My father essentially always worked in piecework. If they had a job, he went in and worked, and if they didn't have it, he didn't get any money.
Right.
So they never knew how much money they were going to get. And certainly he never made anything like what a teacher made, about half of that. Mm-hmm. So, but we always ate well. I mean, we weren't starving like a lot of other people in the neighborhood during that period. Christopher Columbus, though, was a fascinating school because the teachers were so sort of close to the students, and they set up all these laboratories, and you could go and choose anything you wanted. As I said, I went into the physics. It was for physics and chemistry, actually. They had a chemistry lab and a physics lab, and I sort of went back and forth between them. And I used to come home late at night, not late at night, like 6 or 7, I never left school. At 3, school was such fun. I always loved it.
Okay.
I mean, it was a lot more exciting than being home.
Yes.
I mean, you never, of course, in those days, you never had any toys or anything. I mean,
Yeah.
that was just unknown.
Right.
So school was the best school, and the local library, which I discovered at an early age, was the best place, in the whole neighborhood to be at.
So you love to read?
I loved to
great.
read. I would bring home books.
What kinds of books did you love to
Oh, well,
read?
when I was very young, I read things like fairy tales and so on, But what affected me was a little bit later than really being an infant, an infant, sort of very young. My older brother was 7 years older than I was, so if I was 5, he was about 12.
Yes.
And he got started buying Astounding Science stories.
Okay.
And of course, if my older brother came home, I think they were 10 cents. And my brother did, odd job work around, and so he had enough money to buy Astounding Science. And he brought it home, and I started to read it. And I was fascinated by it. I thought it was marvelous. I used to steal them from him all the time. and it was really that got me interested in this. And I remember, I'm trying to remember the actual name. I remember we had a physics class in junior high. Well, it was called General Science. And it was about all kinds of scientific things. I don't know whether they still do that.
An introduction to science.
An introduction to
Yes.
science. And in one of these Astounding Science articles, a lot of which used real physics in them. They weren't real, they were imaginative and they had all kinds of things, but they actually had some real science in it. And I didn't know the difference, of course. And I was only, I think, 7 maybe when I really started to look at these things. So I remember, though, when later on, going to my science teacher in junior high, I can't remember how old I was, not very old, and asking him about something I had read in Astounding Science. And it was about the idea that when something goes very fast, close to the speed of light, you have a compression. And it got shorter. And I asked him about this, and he said, "Oh no, that's just, they're making it up."
No.
He did.
Wow.
And I'll never forgot it, because I believed him for
Yes,
years.
of course.
But as soon as I got into high school, and I talked to the physics teacher there, I learned that was really wrong. No, it was called, there was the man's name starting with F. It was called, it wasn't, they weren't talking about Einstein. They were really talking about a guy who had, before Einstein, talked about this effect.
Yes.
And I can't remember his name now. It starts with an F, I think.
Huh. Okay.
Can't remember. But anyway,
I can't help you.
I remember it because within a year or so, when I got into high school, I found out that he was wrong. And I was just dumbstruck by a teacher being wrong.
The concept of a teacher being
A
wrong.
teacher being just wrong.
Yes. Oh, wow. Okay.
So that was, but the way I got interested was purely accidental. And I was very lucky, because my parents had no education at all.
Now, did they, however, encourage you
No.
to go to school or anything?
Oh,
No. You had to go to school.
Encourage. When I say encourage, they never said anything about it.
Okay.
Because I got good grades all the time.
Yes.
And so, and I'm not sure my parents could read the grades. Could read I mean, they couldn't read English.
Ah. Okay.
They had never gone to school.
Okay.
My mother took a job across the street, actually, in a factory that made dresses for women, cheap dresses for women, and she made skirts. and she got paid 25 cents a skirt. I remember that. And she had to figure out how much she was owed at the end of the day, and I taught her how to multiply.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and she learned how to multiply and never asked me again.
Okay. It wasn't that she couldn't, she just never had the opportunity.
Nobody ever taught her.
Yes.
I mean, she never learned anything. When she actually was taught by, remember, girls couldn't go to school. That wasn't a done thing. But they did bring in somebody to teach her to read and write Yiddish.
Okay.
So she could read and write Yiddish, not English, not Russian. She spoke Russian, obviously, because that was the national language. And she learned to speak English just from living there.
Yes.
And by the time I was born, the family was speaking English.
Okay.
My oldest brother actually was not speaking English when he started in school.
Really? Wow.
Well, where would he learn English?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. How was he going to learn?
Remember, the whole neighborhood spoke the same language.
Yes.
Everybody was the same. There was kind of a line, which was the subway, which went right by a window, incidentally. I can sleep anywhere.
Yes, okay.
They went right by the window. And that line, we were all Jews on this side, except for a few families that weren't. Yeah. And on the other side, there were the Italians. And there wasn't much fighting. I don't know.
Yeah, it wasn't a lot of
contention around. It was, everybody got together. I guess they all played football together.
Okay.
And there wasn't. But what happened was that although my best friend as a child, and if I'm going too far on this, just stop me, was a boy named Raymond Sherman, and when we were 5 or 6 or so, he of course went to Catholic school because all the Christian kids were Catholics.
Yes, of course.
They were either German Catholic or most of them Italian Catholic.
Yes.
So they disappeared from my life, and I went to school, and in my public school classes there was one Italian kid.
Wow.
And all the rest were Jews. So the Jews went to the
public school
system, and the Catholics went to the Catholic school system, and that's how it went.
Okay.
And the schools were wonderful. They really had marvelous teachers in them. They cared about us. We had very big classes because it was a depression, and there was no money in the city to have small classes. But my memory of the classes I went to, almost every kid went to college.
Okay.
And that was because the colleges were free. Free, absolutely free, because nobody in that whole neighborhood for miles around could have afforded to go to college.
Yes.
Nobody, including me.
All right.
Now my brother, my oldest brother went to work. I just need some.
Okay.
I got started on this, and I'm telling you too much, maybe. My oldest brother went to work. He was a sportsman, so he never got the grades to get a scholarship. But my older brother was a very heavy studier, and he worked all the time. And he had scholarships to NYU, and eventually went to NYU medical school. I'll come back to that.
Okay.
In the meantime, I went to Christopher Columbus, which I said was marvelous. And I distinctly remember, leaving, these lights are getting to me, leaving Christopher Columbus and walking around the school and said, gee, what a great place. I'm sorry I'm leaving.
Really?
I really hated to leave that school.
Wow.
Because everything about it was such fun.
Yeah.
Really.
Okay.
Great schools.
So.
And it tells you what happens when you have really fine teachers.
Yes.
In a fine school. And as I said, even though there were a lot of poor kids there, there was a university in each college, in each borough of the city. There were 5 boroughs, and you could, if you passed an exam, it was all done by exam. It was absolutely only the brightest kids got into those schools. And if you passed the exams, you were in. There was no interviews, no nothing. It was purely capability.
Okay.
And I'm very proud of the fact that I think there was a very long time when City College, which I didn't go to, because it was all boys, and Hunter was all girls, so I went to Hunter.
Okay.
And City College had more Nobel Prize winners than any other college in the country.
Wow.
I
wow.
thought that.
That's pretty
Well,
good.
because it was an elite school based solely on how capable you are
Yes.
of of learning. So they got all the brightest kids that had never had an opportunity, and I think that makes the New York City.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And now they charge money, and I think it's a big mistake.
Okay. All right.
So
So, talk to
There
me
we are.
about how when you graduated from high school.
I graduated from high school. I went into Hunter College.
Did you look? Was there any other opportunities?
No,
or
I
that
never
was
looked anywhere else except Hunter because my parents could not afford
anything, and that was the one school that was free.
It was free.
Okay.
So I simply applied at Hunter, got into Hunter. Now the problem was that Hunter was a girls' school, which meant they didn't care much about science.
Ooh.
And I wanted to study physics. Then, I mean, from the time I read about it in Astounding Science, you know, all the time. That was what I planned to do, and they didn't have it. And besides, nobody could get a job in science. It was impossible. I'm talking about. I graduated in January of 1941.
Okay.
And so I started with trying to have a degree in economics.
Really?
And I don't know why, because I just thought it might be interesting. And I was there a year. Now, you may remember that 1941 was very famous because of December 7th.
Yes.
And so on
World
December
War II
7th, remember, I had almost finished 1 year at Hunter and taking all the standard literature and
Everything.
history
liberal
courses.
arts.
It's a liberal arts course. And it was December 7th, and the next day, if you remember, it was Monday, December 8th. And we're at dinner. My oldest brother had gone into the Army in 1940 and had enlisted. He was an enlisted guy in the Army. He was away. I mean, he had just come back, and he was going to go away on December 8th again.
Yes.
And my other brother was still at school. And the knock on the door was strange. I went to the door. We didn't have a phone. We didn't have a phone, of course. And there was my physics teacher, my high school physics teacher, who would come to my apartment, my house in this little tiny place in the
Yes.
Bronx we had.
Yeah.
And he sat down at the table. We were all stunned. And he said, you may have noticed about the war. He said, a good friend of his who had graduated with him in Chicago was running a research lab on 45th Street in Manhattan. And it was run by the International Printing Ink Company. They made all the printing inks for most of the magazines and books and everything. And it was an enormous company in those days. And actually, it was a subsidiary of a chemical company. I forgot the name of the chemical company.
Okay.
And it's all different now. And they had an 8-story large research lab, including a second floor which had newspaper printers, which were enormous, the
Yes.
size of houses.
Right.
Were built into this facility because they made the ink for these, and they constantly did research on getting
Yes.
new inks. And all of the people they had there were all the techs had graduated from the elite high schools, and there was one in New York, in Manhattan, that I'd never heard of. I didn't even know it existed, so I never applied to it.
Yes.
And it says something about living in poor neighborhoods. You don't know anything.
Yeah.
You just don't know anything. I went to he said that they know they're going to lose all these kids. What they did, they were going to they worked all day, and then they went to college at night, mostly to Brooklyn Tech or to City College, mostly
Yes.
to City College. They didn't have any money either. Brooklyn Tech was a private institution. And so he asked me if I wanted a job. I said, okay. It sounded like interesting. And I would be getting money, and I would go to college at night. And so, and I'd spent 1 year in college. So we made the deal that I would go down and get interviewed. And I told them I think I had turned 16 by then. I spent a year in college,
Yes,
so I was
right.
16. Went down, told them I was 18, which was the earliest age you could get a job in New York City. And of course I was 5'9", and I wore makeup. They
had no idea.
They had no idea. So they hired me. And I was one of a number of young women that they then hired, because they, of course, did lose almost all of their techs, who were all in the Army.
Yes.
And I went to work at this place. I'm trying to remember the name. It was called International Printing Inc., right? The Research Labs of International Printing Inc.
Okay.
I got hired there in 1941, and I worked there until the war was over in 1945.
And went to school at the same time.
And went to school. I went to school I went to school from 6 p.m. I got out at 5:30. Went to school at 6 p.m. and worked and took classes. They were compressed classes till 10 p.m. and went home, and then I got home at 11 o'clock at night and went the next day.
And there was some homework in there you squeezed in.
Well, it was an hour to work.
Oh.
I did what other kids did. I did my homework all on the subway.
Okay. Very good.
Very large.
Yes.
And I was fortunate because I was on the next to last stop of the subway, so I always got a seat. And that made it possible, because, and then I also did homework on weekends.
Yes.
You know,
Okay.
so I had it done.
Wow. All right.
Actually, it wasn't, and I changed my degree to physics.
Ah. Okay.
Now,
What college were you?
Well, this is the problem.
Yes.
Remember, a lot of the college kids were in the Army.
Yes.
All the colleges in the city had to reduce their sizes. A lot of their teachers were in the Army. A lot of the professors were in the Army.
Yes, of course.
So what they did was fascinating, and nobody seems to know about this anymore. Certain colleges specialized in certain things, and if you were taking, and most of the work was done at night, because everybody was working if they could. Remember, there's a Navy Yard in New York City. There was Brooklyn Navy Yard, and there were enormous numbers of sailors here because they would bring the ships into the New York dock. I mean, it was a great place for warships, and they repaired them there and so on. So the place, New York City, was very crowded with people working.
Yes.
You know, for the first time in a very, very long time, it changed the whole area. Where am I? Back in.
Yeah, we were talking about you. You had been at Hunter.
Yeah.
And
So I took, as I said, I was taking these classes, and so I took all my mathematics at Brooklyn Polytech. In Brooklyn, I had to get to Brooklyn.
Okay.
I went to Brooklyn, and all my physics and chemistry and so on at NYU, and all my literature art at Hunter.
so you took. So you split up.
There was no other place to take the courses.
But that was allowed. Yeah.
And they
That's how it
made
worked.
arrangements for each other. I don't know how they arranged it, because Brooklyn Poly was a paid school. Somebody paid them to provide the courses that would be needed in other places, and they didn't pay and they cut down on the number of teachers they had, of course, number of professors they had teaching. And sometimes I always had to arrange it so that I was in the same school, same place on any one day.
Yeah,
Like
so
otherwise
you
I would have
didn't-
had to go from
Well, yeah, how would
68th
you
Street
work and
to
then
Brooklyn.
go to...
I couldn't
You couldn't.
get to Hunter at 68th Street, which is 68th Street and Park Avenue. I couldn't get from there, and then between classes that ended at 8 o'clock and one that started at Brooklyn Poly at 8, I couldn't do that. That was in Brooklyn, so I had to arrange it. But we did it, and I got through all that okay.
Okay.
And I was at that time, since Brooklyn Poly was an all-boys school, the only woman in the school.
Oh my God.
And the only woman who had ever been in Brooklyn Poly.
Wow.
I always thought that was funny.
That
I had a
is.
trail of boys behind me as I went to the subway every night.
That's funny. That is. Wow.
And indirectly, actually, that's the way I married my husband, because it's an aside from this, but
Yeah.
one of the guys there whom I dated at Brooklyn Poly went to live in Israel, where my husband had gone to live, and when he was sent to this country, this other guy gave him my phone number, and that's how I met him.
Really? Wow.
So Brooklyn Poly was very good for me.
Very good.
Well,
So what happens
so
next?
well,
You graduate at some
Next,
point.
I'm graduating. It's 1945. I graduated from and I graduated at NYU. And what happened in the last year or two of college, as I was known to the people at NYU, and I have no memory at all of how this happened. I got a full scholarship to the. I stayed there, and I got a full. Now it took me 6 years to get through college because I was going at night.
Yes.
Because I was taking small,
Not
only
Yeah.
classes, only a certain number that I could fit in.
Right.
And so it took me quite a while to get through college. But then I had started at 15, so I wasn't very old. And I had the scholarship. I finished at NYU, and then I was told to I wanted to go to graduate school, so I was told to apply to the government. And now, this was my first nuclear physics class started on August 6th, 1945. The very day that the bomb was dropped.
Oh my goodness.
It was, we were all sort of paralyzed with the fact, with knowing that had happened on that day.
Yes.
Actually, I knew about it earlier. I found out about the Manhattan Project by having some drinks with a guy in a bar about 1944, 43,
Really?
something. And he had been working on it at Columbia. And he told me all about it. All about it. I guess he was drunk. I don't
Yeah.
know. I was stunned. And not long after that, I bumped into a guy that I had been in high school with in uniform. And I said, on Times Square, that's where I worked. I mean, it was on 45th Street.
Yeah.
So I said, oh, he said he was at Princeton. I said, oh, you must be on that bomb job. And he said, shut up. And we went into the Astor Bar, I remember, and I told him how I had learned about it, and he told me to just never say a word about it. I never said a word about it until long after the war to anybody, but I knew all about it.
Wow.
And I'm thinking to myself, how many other people already know this?
Yes. And how many of them are not friendly to the United States? Are there any of them?
I don't know.
Yes. Anyway. Okay.
Anyway, I got an Atomic Energy Commission fellowship. They started that, I think it was started in 46, because there were so few physicists in the United States, and they wanted to build up. Well, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
That was why. So anybody who already was taking physics, I wasn't. I don't think it was a particularly, thing that honored you, but
Yes.
it was something that the government wanted to make sure we had enough of. So I did graduate work mostly, and the thesis was on meson energy. We built our own cloud chamber.
Really?
A group, 2 or 3 of us who were working on the project, built a cloud chamber up on the roof of NYU.
Okay.
It's right, I can't see it from this place, but it's right across Washington Square, and I can still see the place we worked in.
Wow. Okay.
From this, from this house. It had been a garden.
Yes.
On the roof.
Yes, a roof garden.
A roof garden, and we took it over and built this cloud chamber and measured mesons. And I have to tell you one more thing. When you needed particles, what we did, we had a roll of lead. Just a roll of lead.
Yes.
About
lead sheet.
Lead sheet, about 1/4 of an inch thick, rolled up. And inside it, we had hanging a little bottle with cesium in it. Cesium-60, I think it is.
Okay.
And that's what we used. We picked it up with the bottle, open to the world, put it on top of
the cloud chamber.
And tested it. And did what we had to do. Never occurred to us that we were getting cesium-60.
Or getting radiation.
Or getting radiation at all.
Really?
I mean, we knew it, of course, we knew it.
Yeah, but you never, there wasn't any data. Nobody knew about radiation sickness or how much you could stand and how much
you just sat there all the time, sitting in this little
and it was thing. Then you put it back in the lead thing. There was no top on it.
There was no top on it.
The radiation just went up to the sky. Yes.
Oh, wow. I think of it now.
Oh, my goodness.
Anyway, so that was that. And we published a paper in, not a paper, just a letter in the Physical Review.
Okay.
But about that time, I had met my husband. It was 5 years to build a cloud chamber and do all that. It took a lot of time. And I met my husband. That is, we were not married, and we wanted to get married. And he had emigrated to Israel from Britain, from London.
Okay.
Because his family had always been Zionists. I knew nothing about Zionism, nothing about Israel. My family were not interested in it. They were very secular. And they never believed in religion at all.
Yes.
They were kind of socialists.
Yeah, okay.
And his family were a religious Orthodox family, which were anathema to me.
Yes.
But his brother had gone to Israel his brother had been in the British Army, of course, for 6 years in India, had gone to Israel in 1948 and was killed in the war.
Oh, no. Oh, wow.
And so the family were particularly, connected to Israel and its history and what it was doing. And he had emigrated to Israel in 1950.
Okay.
When he was out of college. And I finally, it's a long story, I finally decided that I would go to Israel with him. And then I didn't have any money, of course. I didn't have any money.
Yeah.
I remember some guy.
Because you weren't working. Yeah.
No, I was still at the lab.
You're still at the lab.
I was at NYU. I had a fellowship, which was $1,600 a year. So I had moved down here. Actually, I lived on East 7th Street in the east side of the village.
Okay.
It wasn't really the village. It was the Lower East Side, and it was and I had a roommate I was very fond of. And we decided to get married. We got married in December, and he went off to Israel, and I was supposed to follow him. And I did follow him thereafter, quite a while later. In the meantime, I had to get a job because I had to get some money. He was earning money, but not very much. In Israel in those days, the country had just started, a couple of years before then. In 48, this was 51 when we got married.
Yes.
So it was you know, there was not much food there. I lost 10 pounds the first month I was there.
Wow.
And it was not very easy to live there. And so, actually, I did go there in that year, but before I did that, I told my thesis advisor that I really needed to get out and get some work done, and I would work at night or something. I didn't know what would happen with my thesis because I hadn't finished it.
Yes.
We had gotten a few particles, but not enough to qualify. And well, it's a long story, but anyway, that's fundamentally what happened. And
and your thesis was going to be based on
meson energy.
Yes,
yeah.
on meson energy.
Anderson, though, had an airplane and a lot of money at Caltech, and he had just about that time when we were, you know, trying to finish it, he had come out with an enormous amount of data that we didn't have because we didn't have the resources.
Yes.
And he did the whole thing in an Army airplane. And
so he'd gone up and put a cloud chamber in an airplane
and he had a cloud chamber somebody else built
as the source.
Somebody else built a cloud chamber, of
yes,
course, not him.
Yes.
At Caltech you could do that. You couldn't do that at NYU.
Yeah, right. Okay.
You had to build all your own equipment. We built all our Geiger counters.
Wow. Okay.
We had to build everything.
Yes.
It was a very good experience for me, but it just made the whole thing be much longer. Now, I wasn't suffering in the sense that I had a full scholarship, which I would keep.
Right.
I mean, not just a scholarship, it was a fellowship, so I got paid, actually.
Yes, that's even better.
$1,600 a year, which I lived on, alone.
Okay.
I mean, with a roommate.
Okay.
I'm taking too much time on this.
And so, yeah, you quit the job as a tech at the... or were you doing that too?
Yes, I quit my job. I think I quit the job as a tech. I think I told you in 1945 when I went to graduate school.
Okay, yes, all right, good.
And
okay.
I did explain that.
Yeah, okay.
So I
I understand.
I had an income. I could not live without an income.
Yeah,
my parents could not support me.
I understand.
So I had to get a job, and I had to get a more paying job than that. And so I went to my advisor and I asked him told him what the story was, and he said, well, he told me about a guy who was a headhunter who was pretty good with people in the physics department getting jobs. So I went down to see him and talked to him, and he said there are no jobs in physics now, he said, because the Korean War was on. And the president, who was Truman, decided that we were not going to hire anybody anymore because we just didn't have the money for it.
Okay.
We were fighting a war in Korea.
Right.
So he said, there just aren't any jobs. And I said, you know, have you heard of any jobs in computers? I have no idea why I said that. I have no idea of where I knew about computers.
Yes, but somehow you knew enough to ask
somehow I had read
question.
somewhere about computers, and I just said it. And he said to me, "You know, I never heard of computers, but this morning I got a phone call from somebody in Brooklyn who's looking for people for a computer company. This morning." And I have been so lucky.
Yeah, serendipity.
And that's what happened. I went over to the computer company. It was called Electronic Computer Corporation. Okay. I had never heard of it. They gave me an exam. The guy who was the head of engineering, Gene Leonard, his name was, Eugene Leonard, he gave me a test to design a network. Mm-hmm. I designed a network, I gave it back to him, and I was hired. And I was hired as a logic designer, which they didn't have.
Wow.
That's how I got the job.
Isn't that's amazing.
This seems to happen to me, and I've been just unbelievably lucky. So I got started on the very beginnings. This was in October of 1951.
Okay.
And they had hired a number of people most of them, this was after the war, remember, most of them kids who had come out of City College.
Okay.
And so on. But the people who started the company had already designed computers, because there were a group of people there, I think 3 or 4, who had come from UNIVAC.
Ah, in Philadelphia.
The guy who
yes.
started the company was Sam Lubkin.
Okay.
Sam Lubkin, if I got that name right, I think I've got a little wrong, but anyway, he was in the Bureau of Standards, and they had built a computer in the
Yes.
Bureau of Standards.
Right.
I forgot the name of it.
SEAC.
SEAC, that's right. And he had done the logic. He was a mathematician, and he had a PhD in mathematics. He was really a wonderful mathematician. I mean, he was very incredibly smart.
Yes.
But he would never have hired me. He was afraid of women. He never talked to me. He was just
goodness.
afraid of women.
Wow.
I guess because he was, I don't know why, he was shy.
Okay.
But Gene Lennon was not like that. He was perfectly open, and he didn't mind hiring women.
Okay.
I did this. I had more education than most of the other kids they hired out of school.
Yeah.
I mean, I had 5 years of graduate school. So he hired me at $4,500 a month from $1,600. It was more money than I ever thought I would make in my life. And they sat me down, and I started to, and I was put to design immediately. No education at all.
Right.
The this machine for the for designing ranges for guns for for the Argonne Lab.
Oh, so the same thing that ENIAC was originally for doing.
Was it really?
ENIAC was designed to do firing tables.
I didn't know that.
Yes, the ENIAC was a project to speed up making the firing tables for guns, because they were coming out with new guns and they were calculating the firing tables with lots of women, in a room.
Oh, and calculators.
On calculators.
Yeah, I remember that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they were falling
called the
way
women
behind in the
calculators.
war.
Yeah.
And so somebody came up with the idea of doing it electronically.
Did the ENIAC really work well?
Yes, it worked.
Yeah.
Yes.
And why did they start getting another? That was before 1951.
Oh, yes. The
That was in
ENIAC
40s,
was actually
late 40s.
working by 1947 or 48.
Yeah. The UNIVAC, I remember, the first commercial UNIVAC was delivered from, this is Eckert-Mockley, these guys.
Yes, yeah,
worked
and
out.
Eckert-Mockley were the people that did the ENIAC.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they left and started UNIVAC.
But UNIVAC was the general machine, the
Yes,
first general
general-purpose
machine,
machine.
and it went into GE in, it was at a factory in St. Louis, I think.
It was in the Midwest, yes.
Yeah.
And it went to GE, but before that, they delivered one to the Census Bureau. That was the first
yes.
contract. And the first commercial customer, I believe, don't swear, hold me to it, was GE,
It was GE, I
was
remember
GE.
that.
Yeah.
Anyway, the UNIVAC was the first certain, and that was 49.
Yes.
I do remember that. I'm pretty
Okay.
certain that was the year.
Okay,
So this was only 2 years later.
yes. My goodness, and so they had a contract from...
And Sam Lubkin from Bureau Standards first started. He was from Brooklyn. His family was from Brooklyn, so he started it in Brooklyn, and he got the people from Eckert-Mockley. And the reason he got the people from Eckert-Mockley was this was the time of the terrible business of getting people who were supposedly communists and putting
yes.
them. It was McCarthy time,
Yes, okay.
and these guys all had backgrounds of the people who came to our company, must have had, it was never discussed, but they had backgrounds that were a problem, and the Eckert-Mockley people said they couldn't work there anymore. They couldn't get secret clearance, and you needed clearance because they were doing things for the government.
Got it. Okay.
Whereas, so they, I don't know if that was true of Sam Lupkin either. I don't know.
Yes.
I never had any inkling of that. But the other guys I know left because they were sort of asked to leave.
Okay.
And they couldn't get clearance. None of them really had any real problems. But they had to go because of McCarthy.
Wow. Okay.
So I was benefited because there were people there who had designed computers before. I really had a real advantage.
Yes.
And one of them, sort of sketched out the general idea and said, design it. And I sat down and designed this machine I told you about, which had to have a vector capability. And maybe that's what was different, that the other machine was slow. It probably didn't, it surely didn't have a vector
Yes,
calc.
of course they did not.
Yeah.
No, it had separate. It wasn't really a general purpose computer. See?
Oh, really?
The ENIAC. The ENIAC had special, had adders, subtractors, multiply units,
You mean it was
divide
a copy
units,
of a
and even one
calculator?
square root unit.
You mean it was a calculator, really?
But it was programmed. They had figured out how to
Did they do it with
program it
plugs?
with plug
Plugs.
boards
Oh.
originally. And then some brilliant person figured out how to use the function tables that it also to actually program it faster. But it was not a stored program computer.
Oh, then it wasn't really a computer.
Well, yes, it was the first, but it had many of the functions of a computer. Okay, it's like Burroughs.
In my
It was not a stored program machine. You're correct.
But in my mind, if you don't have a branch instruction, it's not a computer.
I think it did.
Okay,
but it was plugboard.
Yeah, not plugboard. Yeah, but
Yeah, you could still do
yeah,
that.
I guess it could be.
Of course, you could have a comparator.
But I didn't really know it was like that. I thought it was a stored program machine always.
No, it was not. They hadn't invented that yet.
Thank you for telling me.
Okay.
I didn't know.
All right,
Anyway,
so
the machine that I designed was a stored program, but it was all tubes.
Yes, I'm sure it was.
And the memory was a magnetic drum.
Yes, okay.
And it was about so high and so big around.
Do you remember,
I remember
was there a name for it or a product name?
It was just called the Argonne machine.
The Argonne?
Not Argonne.
You mean
no,
Aberdeen? Was it Aberdeen? Proving Ground?
I think it must have been. It must have been.
Argonne was a national lab of the
yeah.
Atomic Energy Commission. Aberdeen
Yeah.
was
You know why?
the Army's...
Because I've been on the Brookhaven National Lab board for years. I'm not on it now. I just stopped this year, but for about 13 years. And so I'm so used to be talking about Argonne because that was another national lab that we often did work with.
Right.
So that's why I think I made the mistake.
Okay.
But it was Aberdeen. You're right. It was Aberdeen.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. So
I wouldn't have thought I could forget that.
Okay.
So we designed it with a magnetic drum, and most of essentially the active memory was essentially largely on the drum, where you had a head at one place and
recirculating delay lines on the
recirculating delay lines on it.
So it's fundamentally a serial machine then.
Oh yeah, it was. Almost all the machines you built those days, I think were I don't know the others, but
I think you're right because it was too expensive.
It was too expensive to put them all in flip-flops, which is
make
the
it
only
parallel. Yes.
Yeah, you had a few flip-flops at each end.
Yeah.
For buffer.
Right.
And the rest of it was all on the machine.
Okay.
It was slow, but it could do the job. I mean,
it had vector instructions. It probably was very fast at doing certain kinds of calculations.
I think that what happened at Aberdeen was that machine was probably too slow, and that's why they ordered another one that was all electronic. and that had a vector
and had stored program.
And had stored program and had vector capability.
Okay. Very cool.
And that was interesting doing that vector. I enjoyed that. I remember.
Okay.
And since I didn't know it had never been done, I did.
Now, what,
I didn't know anything.
Were you the only logic designer, or were there other?
I was the only logic designer then.
So you had to design all the logic for all
of it,
the whole machine.
all of it.
Wow.
There was nobody else I worked with. In fact,
yeah, other people worked on circuits and the
they
drum
worked on
and
this,
things like
the
that.
circuits
Yeah, of course,
and so
there
on,
were
and
engineers who did
and
that.
well, there were a lot of mechanical stuff. I mean, there was the drum and there was an input out, but I don't remember what there was.
Yeah,
but there were mechanical things that it needed. We had a you know, physical laboratory. We had a workspace in which people who really did things with their hands did them.
Yes. Okay.
So there were physical activities involved, and we used these tubes.
Very good.
It was so hot in the summer.
Oh.
We didn't have air conditioning. We didn't have anything.
Oh my goodness.
It was so hot in Brooklyn in the summer that everybody used to walk around practically naked.
Wow.
You know, I was the only woman there, of course.
Yeah.
And of course I did wear clothes.
Yeah.
But all the others, they walk around with aprons on and their asses were out. I mean,
Really?
mostly in the shop.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. All right.
It's very funny when I'll tell you another story later, but that made me very mad. Okay. So what happened was I worked there for a while, and my husband then went back, had finished his job a year or so later, went back to Israel, and I stayed on a while just to get enough money. So you needed money to go to Israel because there was nothing there. You had to bring, if you had a place to live, you had to bring a stove, you know, a refrigerator, or everything that you wanted to live with. There was nothing there. When I say nothing, I mean
I understand.
I mean, they just had a war.
Yes.
So it was very difficult. But what happened then, I looked around, and they were talking about computers, but there was a guy from Princeton who was interested in setting up a place at the local university, which was the Technion.
Yes.
In Haifa, to start something in computers, but there was actually no jobs for me, and I was pretty depressed there because there was just nothing for me to do.
Yes.
And my husband was very unhappy because his family were giving him a hard time, and he was sick of that. And he had spent, remember, a year or more in the United States, free of family fighting, which was going on, and so he decided that he was better off in the United States than in Israel, and we came back together.
Ah.
And I had written before that back to Dr. Lupkin, the guy who owned who was president of the company, and asked him if I could have my old job back, and he wrote me a letter saying yes. And only with that letter could I get my husband into the country. And the people at the embassy, said at the American embassy said they had never seen a place where the woman got the husband in and proved she had a job.
Really?
Yeah, they said they'd never seen that before.
They'd never seen it. Was always the other way around. Yeah. Okay.
I was talking about the machines we built in that period at Elecom. And I told you about the gun range system that had vector instructions in it. And another machine that we built was a machine for handling subscriptions, and that was Fortune magazine. And we built that again, there was a tube machine in a standard organization. There's nothing much to say about it. It was used it was not online or real time or whatever, just simply a straight computer for a commercial application. Nothing more to say about it. But we also built a an idea was a small accounting machine, really small. In spite of the fact that it was still a tube machine, we could build it very simple. Most of the memory, all the memory was on magnetic drums also. Yes. But the application was very simple, and so it didn't have to be very big. And we would, in the process of that, when it turned out to be 1957, and on March 15th of 1957,
oh, wow.
the company that had bought Elecom, namely Underwood Corporation, it was a typewriter company that wanted to get into the computer business, when it found out everybody else was getting into the computer business, but it discovered that it didn't have the money, and it went bankrupt. And and what they did was essentially by calling in and by telephone on the loudspeaker system, they announced that the place was closed. So
from the main office.
Yeah, and from the main office, and for all of us to just leave. It was practically a riot, but I don't think this is the time to discuss what the people inside did at that moment, but not me.
Yes.
I didn't take all the telephones.
That gives me a hint.
As some people did.
Yes.
And everything else. And so we were all out of jobs, and including me. And I did get a job at a place called Teleregister.
Okay, now you started to talk about a very simple machine that was for accounting, but that never got finished.
I mean, never got finished. It was really all built, and we had debugged it, and it was sort of ready to consider for a market as a marketing machine, but nothing ever happened to it. It just sat there.
Yeah.
It was not ready to be. It just nothing ever happened.
Yeah, it was designed and prototyped.
Designed and prototyped and working, and it was a beautifully designed little machine that was very efficient.
Yeah.
But it never got anywhere.
Okay.
Teleregister was a company that had built, if one can remember in the movies of the 1930s, you'd often see a brokerage house with a lot of people watching numbers on a big screen.
Yes.
Numbers, and the numbers would go around to the next price, and one number would change here and another there, and they had maybe a couple of hundred such boxes of little movable cartridges.
Yes, and it was the stock. They took the stock ticker information and made a visual display so everybody could see it, rather than everybody having to look at the ticker tape.
These little tapes that were also available.
Okay.
And Teleregister ran that, and of course it was largely a communication system. It was all done by relays.
Okay.
Of course, electronics didn't exist when this system went in, and when Teleregister started and built this entire countrywide system that distributed the information about the stock market.
Okay.
Almost instantaneously.
Yes.
But they wanted to build a system for the stock market, would replace that using computers to get information out to the world. And they had ideas for other applications that would also work. And all of the ideas that they were working on were not standalone computers, but were computers that were tied up with communication systems. Okay. And so this was essentially, and I had actually some experience with that at Elecom, and we had talked about that to some extent. So I had some knowledge of it, but very little.
Of communication systems and how to tie in, possibly. Okay.
And so this was the first job, was to build a real computer. Teleregister had worked in relays. They had engineering staff that was very capable, and they had used relay logic to do real logic. But of course, everything was very, very limited, and everything was essentially fixed. There was nothing that they had ever programmed. And they had actually done some work, sent a guy to MIT to find out how to design them, but he had never really ever designed one himself. Had seen it, and I have to say it was not really a suitable design for a computer.
So they
it
had
some
started their design.
So they had started a design, and I think then they found that it was not really possible to have a guy with absolutely no background in the industry, or have somebody there who knew anything about the whole business of electronics, that they could do that. So they decided to hire somebody, and they hired me to run the department of design.
Okay.
So I walked in, I had been head of the logic design department at Elecom, largely because I was the first one hired. And I continued to be head of the logic.
And you hired everybody else, yes.
Yeah, and I hired everybody else, but I continued in the same job at, which is important, at Teleregister, except that I had 10 people who were relay designers that we had to teach. I had to teach personally how to do in electronics, and they learned very quickly because the concepts were the same, even if the implementation was quite different.
Yes.
Just a minute, let me get, I just have some notes here.
That's fine.
The first system we actually built was a computer for banks. Now this was built originally as a general computer for savings banks, and it was on a contract for a particular saving bank, but the idea was to build it so that it was not specialized. And I set up the system, and we designed it and delivered it. And remember that there were tellers, and the action happened at tellers, and we had instruments at the teller's site. So the information was then plowed back into the memory of the computer, which again was drums.
It was all drum system?
All magnetic drums. That was the only real memory system that existed.
So this is a serial drum machine
serial drum machines, and all these machines were serial.
Now is this going to be vacuum tubes or transistors yet?
No, I think we never built vacuum tubes in that company.
Okay, so you moved from relays to transistor logic.
We educated the 10-man department and taught them how to design in electronic logic.
Okay.
And they designed that, and they converted very easily. It was not difficult at all, and they were very good people. Now this had a communication system, but it was essentially an indoor communication system between the terminal and the machine, which was sitting off somewhere in the distance,
yes.
And which actually did all the work of bringing the information about each customer up to date. And it worked very well, very quickly, and they actually later on sold them to other banks. But this, as time went on, they sold quite a number of them. But by that time, I was gone.
Do you remember did it have a model number or anything that?
We all called it the bank system.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It was internal.
The Underwood bank system.
The Underwood bank? No, it was not Underwood. It was Teleregister.
I'm sorry, my mistake. Teleregister
banking system.
Okay.
Yeah, we didn't have a number. It was a commercial thing, and it had a name.
Yeah. Okay.
The next instrument we did, and actually we pretty much used the same central computer design.
Okay.
But we changed it because the connection to the communications area was so different. And this was for the American Stock Exchange. Remember, they had very long-term, the Teleregister people had worked with the stock exchanges for a very long time, decades.
Yes.
And they knew each other very well, and the American Stock Exchange wanted to upgrade their system. So we took the same computer that we had developed earlier, which it was built as a computer to interface to a communication system.
Right.
And we had a communication section at Teleregister that was separate from the computer design part of it, but we obviously had to design these things. It had to integrate the design.
Together, yes.
So we worked together. So we worked together with me being the head of the computer design department, and somebody else running the communication.
Yeah. Can I just interrupt for a second? Now, this machine, the machines at Teleregister, these were binary machines. Were they character-oriented machines, or were they pure binary? Do you remember?
I have a memory that most of the stuff we ended up doing were all character-oriented.
Yeah, it would make sense.
It would make sense to do it. It would slow it down if you had to convert all the time.
Yes.
And you were real-time. Remember, this was a real-time
application.
And so you did, in these kind of cases, you really had to worry about the speed.
Yeah.
And integrating them had a lot to, you had a lot of calculation to consider in the time, the information, how fast it had to be analyzed and stored and so on. And that had a lot to do with the communication system, which, remember, were very slow in those days.
So it was probably a decimal arithmetic character-oriented machine.
I do not think we had any. I think it did not have alphabeted. It was really all.
It was numeric.
It was financial.
Yes, so it was probably all four bits.
Probably 4 bits. I think it was 4 bits.
Okay.
And so far we're talking about both of them.
Yes.
And the person who owned that particular item would have an account number anyway. I mean, they would be known as an account number, so you really didn't need any characters, for it. The third system was really the one I'd like to talk about at some length, because it was the most interesting one and very new. It was for United Airlines, and it was the first passenger reservation system. But I have to describe it differently, because it does differ from the passenger reservation systems that most people know about now.
Okay.
And they've probably forgotten about what was there and the time it was designed, which was in about 1957, 1958. For one thing, you had to have the terminals were not at where the computer was. The terminals were all around the country, and there was a communication system, a special purpose communication system that was set up to be all connected in a loop. And actually, I should say there were really 2 loops. One that has started that was based in Denver and went throughout the West Coast, and the other double loop it was through the East Coast.
But all based, the computer was at Denver.
The computer was at Denver.
Okay.
And there were actually, the requirements were really very difficult, because this was going to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You could not have a failure. And so one of the major problems to solve was how did you arrange this so that wouldn't happen? First of all, of course, it had to be semiconductors, and you couldn't design a system like this until you had semiconductors, because the down rate in tubes was just too high.
Yes.
I know of only one system that was in any way like it, and I don't know anything about it, and that was the system the United States government was using for communications in the Arctic somehow, and I really don't know how it worked, but I know that it was a large communication system with some central processes watching. They were somehow watching Russia.
Yes.
I do not obviously know much about it, except that it existed.
Okay.
But as far as I know, there was no commercial system like this had been built before. And on top of the requirement for what I call, it wasn't fail-safe. I called it a fail-soft system, because I wanted to be able to have multiple computers and to set them up so that the information could go into any computer, and if something happened, what you did was essentially pull the computer off the line, and you just got slower. I mean, you could handle fewer requests, but you never lost all of them.
Yes.
So you always had some machine on the line.
Okay.
And indeed, I met later on, long later, I met the fellow who was sent from Teleregister for permanently to run the system, and he was a guy who had built the system and put it together and knew how it worked. And he told me that it never went down in 11 years. They used it for 11 years and that it never went down.
Wow.
The central computer system,
Yeah.
all down.
Wow.
So it actually did succeed in
doing what it was supposed to.
It did. And I said, I thought that what I would do here is actually, and I don't know that we could do it actually on the air here, but I could show you how it was designed so that not only would the central machine not go, always have some capacity, but that the communication system was built in the same way. There was 60, when we first put it on, 60 terminals in 60 cities, for each of which had a number of input devices, and those devices were set up on a privately designed communication system where the lines went through microwave links throughout the country, and were supposedly, there were always 2 lines for each place, and there was never supposed to be the set lines were never supposed to be in the same on the same microwave link. This turned out not to be true. The AT&T put 2 lines on the same link, which some guy blew up.
Oh my goodness! And that's how you discovered.
That's how we discovered it, and it did take the system down. It was only the communication system, the terminal that went down, not the computer system.
So just to get a little bit more clarification, you said there were 60 terminals.
And they had to have a response of 1 second.
Okay. Now, were these 60 terminals, or were these 60 sort of local hubs?
They were hubs.
With multiple agent stations tied into one hub.
Yes, they were essentially a system themselves.
Yeah, a little system.
And they had a number of stations.
Okay, that's what I thought.
But what did I call them? I can't remember, but it was really a hub.
Yes.
Yeah, with a whole system.
And going to a bunch of agent terminals.
But going to a bunch of agent terminals.
But then they would all come together.
And then all feeding the messages in one after the other.
Through this communication system.
Through the communication system.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, as you would see. They probably had they had a lot less traffic than we have now. So I don't know that any one of them was, very big. But nevertheless, it was a multiple. I guess it was a multiple terminal system.
Okay.
But it was 60 cities. I remember quite well.
All right.
But I do think they probably added them afterwards.
And you said something about, I think earlier, maybe not on the tape, that they divided the West Coast and the East Coast separately. So there was a communication loop through the West Coast, and then a communication loop.
I was going to draw that whole system for you.
Oh, very good.
And I don't know how we can do this. I'll tell you what the important thing is, but I can't really draw this over the machine.
Maybe. Yeah, I'm not sure whether we can do this. We can try.
Well, let me just tell you some of the issues.
Yeah, why don't you tell me
first.
some of the features?
Well,
because I think if we're going to draw it, we probably need to move the camera so it's pointing down at what you're drawing and do all that, which we can do.
I'm a terrible draftsman, incidentally.
Oh, all right. You always had a template when you did Logic, right? The AND gates and the OR gates were all...
Logic was easy, but drawing systems
was hard.
Required somebody who really is a draftsman.
Okay.
the issue was that, so what I decided to do in terms of this problem of FailSoft was I looked at the numbers, and if you tried to figure out what the probability of failure was, it was very difficult to do. These were one of the first systems in using transistors.
Yes.
You didn't know how good they would be. You didn't know what the mean time to failure would be. And normally speaking, I thought it would, you certainly had to have two machines. You couldn't stand the situation where you had to have one and you'd be able to switch to another if the machine went down. I didn't want the machine to ever be seen as down from the outside. So I had to have a way of switching, and then I thought 2 is not enough. I don't know what we need, but 2 sounds like and I actually tried to do some calculations, which were full of just wild estimates because really you didn't know the fundamental numbers.
Okay.
But I came to the conclusion that 2 made me frightened, got me frightened. So I decided that we would use 3 processes, complete processes, each operating independent. And then I said, how are we going to know when they go down?
Exactly my question.
And I didn't. There was one thing you could do, and it would be it's easy to think of. You could run a special program through some period of time, and each one of these things, and then if it failed, you just took that machine off. That was easy and obvious. But I felt that was too slow, because I really wanted to give the impression of this being worked all the time. So what I decided to do, and it sounds kind of crazy, but it seems to have worked, is that what I would do was tie these 3 machines together.
Okay.
By monitoring specific points in where they worked. And then if you ran it on on a clock, and you could do that and that was easy to determine that that the clock was working.
Yes.
At a single clock, you could as the information went through the machine, sometimes you could run a program that was just a single program and follow it and know when something went down, because you were actually testing the signals at a number of points inside the machine.
Okay.
And you could do that as a single cycle. It didn't take any time at all. It was just another additional thing that went through the system.
Yes.
The message that went through the system. And you could check the system out and switch the system off again automatically. So you could switch one machine down. The way and if you looked on the other side of it, on the entry where the messages were coming into the machine for answers, and the answers were then going out over the communication system, there was actually that system went onto all 3 machines, so that the first machine would pick up a message and take it off immediately, the first one that got it, and if it was busy, the message would go to the second machine, and if that was busy, the message would go to the third machine. And if the first machine was out, all it did was go to the second machine.
Yes.
So you never knew I had to fix things or had to move things. I mean, it was automatically that this went 1, 2, 3, and it was natural for the machine to operate that way. So essentially you couldn't, if anything happened to any one machine, you never had to stop.
Now, what if something happened to the third machine, and there was enough, there was a queue of messages, and you just circled it around?
Well, where it would always go to the first one.
It was just a circulating queue.
It would just miss.
Okay.
It would just be taken off. It's as though, let me look at fingers. You have these fingers sitting on the messages. The messages are coming in. And if this one is working, then it went to this one, then it went to this one, then it went to the... Essentially, it went through the system and picked whatever was next.
Yes, okay.
And since you never had all 3 down at once, you always had some capacity.
Yes, might slow down
Might
if
slow
it was
down.
heavy load, but
It might send messages say busy. You know, then if what happened is there was something where you just had a signal, an electrical signal that just went through and said we're not on.
Yeah.
I mean, but it never happened. And really, the calculation had been made that any one machine could do all the traffic. Any one machine could do. You only needed one machine to do traffic.
wow, okay.
The other two machines were really for safety and for the fact that who knows, the traffic could get bigger. And
Yes.
it did. And it
Yes,
did. You
of course.
didn't know.
Yeah.
So there was this switching. The most interesting part was the switching system.
Yes. Very good.
And that worked beautifully. And there was a similar system, not a similar system, but there was another kind of system in the communication lines in which there were two lines. One went, the information went one direction in a circle through all the terminals. I call them terminals, but they're really hubs, as you said.
Yes.
And there was another communication system that went the other way. The communication system was a very difficult problem, and I didn't design the communication system. That was the other department. But it was very interesting because you had to have 1 second response. That was the spec. And that was very difficult. And we found that AT&T, to whom we went obviously immediately for the specialized communication system, could not do it. They said they weren't advanced enough to provide a 1 second response system. And we went to Eindhoven, to the Netherlands, and Philips was a communication system in Europe, had very fast. This was all by relay. Now remember that
yes.
this was not a period where you had the communication system could be built out of using electronics, and they had very, very fast relays, which apparently AT&T did not have. Mm-hmm. And they were the ones who built this communication system with a system where, since there were two lines going there, if any hub went down, part of it, you could actually take the two lines and connect them together on either side. And if you did that, the communication still worked, except only that terminal, that hub would have gone. One city would have gone down.
Yes.
Not any other part of the communication system, because you couldn't tolerate a system where something went down in a city and brought the whole system down, which would have been appalling.
Why did they one go clockwise and one go counterclockwise? Do you remember why they didn't go together?
Because consider you have two lines, you want to connect them. So one is this way and one going this way. You could do that.
Oh, I see.
And it provided what you did was make another loop.
Yes,
you just cut it off and it made its own loop.
Okay. Yes.
Otherwise, if they were going the same way, couldn't do that.
Yes. Okay. All
I
right.
didn't know any different. It was just switched, automatically switched.
Yes. Okay.
So it worked.
Good.
And it was. I read somewhere that they actually ran. They had 2 second the effective time took 2 seconds to get a reply. But I'm sorry to receive the message. But it was certainly designed for 1 second,
okay.
and it may have actually been slower when they actually were working
finally
it.
got built.
Actually, finally got built. I really don't know. I mean, I don't remember.
Do you remember how the memory was connected to these machines? Because, of course, they all have to access the same passenger flight, reservation information. But it needs to be written more than one place, presumably.
And there was a memory system that had access to any of the three machines. You could.
Okay. And it was a drum.
And they were all magnetic drums.
All magnetic
big,
drums.
Very big,
Yes.
and a lot of them.
Okay.
And I remember once, I just remembered this, sitting there and saying, my God, if there are 100 of these drums in this thing and they're all going in the same way, they're going to move this building. And I suddenly, I just got a chill down my back. I remember I was absolutely paralyzed. And I set up I wrote a note and set up a spec to the field service people who would set the whole thing up, that the drums had to run half in one way and half in the other. I forgot that until this minute.
Okay.
I mean, it was a kind of crazy problem, but it was real.
Yes. Okay. Wow. Very good.
It was good that I had studied physics and not only electronics.
Exactly.
So anyway, there were a lot of big, heavy drums, because the density of drums in those days was very low. I mean,
yes.
I remember the first drums in those early machines in 1951. I think they had about 100 bits per inch. Really? I mean, that was probably per centimeter, but I mean, it was hardly any density at all. It was really, really very, very, very small amount of memory, which we thought at the times was very nice, but
yes,
it was
okay.
It was very different. Okay, and I think let me just take a look here for a moment and
all right.
And see if I've that company was in Stamford, so I had to commute. My husband was working in New Jersey, so we had an apartment in the city, New York City, and I had to commute up to Stamford, and this was very difficult. I wanted to start a family, etc. There were a lot of problems, and so I went to the head of the VP in charge of this whole design group, and told him the truth, that I really needed to go. I couldn't do that if I was not somewhere closer, if I was not in the city somewhere. I didn't know how I could manage anything if I was up in Connecticut, and it took me an hour and a half to get there and an hour and a half to get back.
Right, that's a terrible commute.
Well, because you had to get not only the train up there, but you had to get a car somehow to get you to the plant, which was not right in the center of was nowhere near the train, where the train was. He was very nice, and he said to me, I think this is a very characteristic story of the time. He said he'd get a job for me. I didn't have to worry about it. He'd find me a job. And it turned out that he knew the people at the New York stock market. And it turned out that the fellow who was in charge of communications at the stock market, which really was all which was the entire engineering department in the stock market, was called communications.
Yes.
Was run by this guy who was retiring. And they were looking for somebody, and the guy I worked for knew that, and talked to them, and they suggested that the fellow who was leaving come and talk to me, which he did, and he hired me for the job. But this job, it turned out, had to be approved by the board of directors of the New York Stock Exchange.
Okay.
Because I guess it was I really don't remember
well, it was
anymore.
quite vital. Communications were an integral part.
It would be a vice president part job. And so I came back and told Teller Register that I would be leaving at a certain time. This was now about 1960, 61, sometime in there.
Yep.
That I would be leaving, and he knew about it. I mean, he had set it up actually, so it was all very companionable. And it turned out we set it up for some months ahead of time when the other guy would be retiring, etc. And then he called me a few weeks later, and he said, I need to talk to you. I went down to the stock market and talked to him, and he said the board, the board said that they could not hire me. And I said, what? Why? I mean, you know, at the time, I was probably one of the 2 people in the world who could design a machine for them.
Yes.
I mean, I was really just, you know, stunned. And he said, what the board said, and the guy was so sorry to say this. I mean, he was very nice. And he said to me, they said that you were a woman, you'd have to be on the stock market floor from time to time, and the language on the floor was not for a woman's ears. I had worked in laboratories all my life.
Yes, with guys.
I had seen practically naked men working on these hot machines. I said, what in the world was he talking about? But there was no way I could get back to them.
Wow.
So that tells you the situation of women at the time.
And so what year is this?
1960. It was before the women's movement.
Yes. Wow.
It was before the women's movement.
All right.
And it was devastating.
Of course it was.
It was really devastating. I think now of course it's easy to say now, because the attitude of the women, of me, my attitude at the time was, in a sense, just simply paralysis. I didn't know what to do, and women, it was so a part of me that you didn't object when women were turned away. You used to it. You were so used to it that you didn't try to fight against it. The young people who came after me, who really came after the black movement and who learned from them, and then when the women really started to object to how they were being treated, that was in the later 60s and 70s, because they had learned from the black, you know, the movement of black people in this country. But at that time, 1960, it was like the old thing. I'm going to give you I think this is important.
Yes.
So I'm going to give you another example.
Okay.
I told you that Marion Keller, who was who had in 1975 the highest level job in the country as a woman, was at GE, was a senior vice president at GE. And I were on the same board. This is much later. And we talked about this experience, and she told me, let me tell you mine. She said when she first got a job at the beginning of the war, because the war was on, at General Electric, she was on she had a degree in physics, and she worked on the drafting board in one of these drafting places that has, you know, 200 people doing drafting in the days before computers.
Yes.
And there were only a couple of women there, very few women, and they were hiring them, of course, because the war was on, and they knew they would have trouble with getting men there. And this is in the aircraft department of General Electric. And she was there about 6 months, and at that point they were reviewed and they would get a little raise. That was the way GE worked. And so that happened. She got a raise of $2 a week, and I think she was making, you know, like 18 or 19. And then she was in the ladies' room, the other woman was there, and the other woman told her, oh, I got a raise of $3 a week. And Marion was really frightened because she thought she had done something wrong. So she went to the head of the department, and she told him that she had heard that this other woman had $3 and she had only gotten $2 a week raise, and she didn't understand. Had she done something wrong? She would like to know, because she would like to do the right things. And he said, oh no, he said, but she's a blonde. That's a true story.
Oh my goodness.
That was what it was like.
Yes. Wow.
And she didn't say anything.
Okay.
And I didn't say anything.
But both of you remembered it for your
Boy, didn't
entire
we.
life.
And I have to say now that I think what I really should have done was to ask to see the chairman of the board, and to go up to him and say, I have heard all the dirty words that anyone has heard in my lifetime, and it would not bother me for one instant. And furthermore, you are not going to find anybody who can build this machine in this country. And he didn't. He hired people and fired them and hired them and fired them, and never got to get a machine that could be done. Except much later.
Yeah, eventually.
When they were just available machines that you could buy from somebody.
Exactly.
And he lost a lot.
Wow. Okay.
So that's that story.
That story.
But I do tell that story to a lot of to women, because I get the impression that nowadays women don't know what it was like. Exactly. And I think they should.
Yes. All right.
Okay.
So what happens next in your career?
Well, what happened was I talked to the people at Digitronics was the name of a company that had been built from the people who had been fired when they were Elecom, when Underwood went bankrupt.
Ah, okay.
And there was a new company they were in the same place. A group of them had gotten together and formed a company they called Digitronics, and were building a lot of various kinds of equipment that were all digital. But for instance, paper tape readers.
They were very famous for their paper tape readers. Because those were the best paper tape readers.
Yeah, did they?
Photographic,
I didn't know.
photo tape, paper tape readers that were, worked on photo cells.
So that was the kind of thing that they were working on, and so they asked me to. They wanted me to come back there, and they offered me a good deal, and with a lot of what is the word? A sort of easiness about how much time I had to spend coming and going and so on. And so that worked very well. One of the things that I did there, that's interesting, is there was a job. This was a special
what year
purpose.
is this now?
Now I got back there in about 1960-61.
Okay.
I just didn't get the job at
and so
New York Stock Exchange, and I went back there. And it was probably a few months later that I took a job there, and I really did. I was so depressed about it that I didn't even try to look in other places.
Okay.
I just went back to the people I knew respected me.
Yeah.
And I didn't have that kind of problem. And I certainly didn't have that problem at Teleregister. I didn't have that problem at Teleregister, even though I walked into a group of 10 men who were doing the designs, and I walked in as their boss. They didn't know me from anything. And we had absolutely no trouble. We were all friends. We worked together, and we worked together with great fun.
Yeah.
So that problem had never really existed for me before.
Yes.
So this kind of thing was such a shock that I just didn't know what to do. And I said I went back to Digitronics, and one of the interesting things I did there during the next year was a racetrack. It turned out that right nearby, where the company was on Long Island, was Roosevelt Raceway, and they, raceways have these big screens with all the information listed on the screen, but it was run essentially mechanically. People just moved the information up and down, and it got the, it was presented. I mean, they had it wired to a desk, but that's all. It was done manually, and you would be happy to know how they got the odds.
Okay.
There was a guy sitting at a desk, and when the numbers were, the numbers went through these little machines, mechanical machines, and gave the number of bets on this horse and the number of bets on that horse. And they read the numbers to this guy, and in his head, he did the various divisions and multiplications, and spoke the rate out, and he was always right. Done through the human mind.
A human computer.
A human computer did those calculations, and then they would just type them in to the board and put them up on the board. And I remember, I didn't know, and I'd never been to a racetrack, actually.
Yes.
And so they took me down to the racetrack to find out how the racetrack worked. And I went through all of the various places. And when I saw that guy staring into space and just, he had earphones on, they were telling him what the numbers were on the machines, and he just simply, machines, when they were mechanical, he just spouting out the odds. I was dumbstruck.
How can he do that?
That's what, yeah. I mean, when you think of it, how could you do it? I mean, these numbers appeared fast. And the days when they didn't have computers, what did they do? It never occurred to me to think of it, but that's what they did.
Okay.
and then they warned me that I have to say I was frightened while I was going through these things. The whole thing was so eerie. The whole way in which this track worked was, and the people who ran it scared me to death. But they were perfectly fine people. I mean, it was just me that had never been to a racetrack before and didn't know how they worked. And they gave me some money and let me bet, and I won. And I don't think they planned it that way. I just did win. Anyway, I designed this racetrack system. They warned me that if that system went down, there'd be a riot. And the system never went down. I mean, I had already learned how to do all this, so that it was there was a lot of safety involved in the system. And the thing that was most interesting was that one day we didn't design or build the lighting system. We just tied into it. But one day something happened. The power went down, and the lighting system went out, and there was a riot. It was true. It was true. There would be a riot if the lights went out.
Yes.
And that's what happened. So that's the racetrack system. And I think that was the first racetrack system that had been built.
Okay.
And they built more of them. I think they built more of them later.
That's fascinating.
Okay, and there were a lot of other small systems at Digitronics, but what happened was I realized, and I had realized for some time, that when you come down to it, from the first day I went to work in the computer industry in 1951 to, by this time, towards the end of 1960s, I had the same job. I ran the logic design department.
Okay.
I had never had another job, and I'm looking up the next row up to vice president, and I knew damn well that I would never get that job. That job was for a man, and I would never have that job. And my experience at the stock exchange had taught me that. And so, what happened then was that I was still a friend of all the people I had worked with all these years, and some of them who had made a lot, who had left the company, started other businesses, done very well. And this is Milt Schwartz, particularly, and he said, start your own company. It's the only way to get anywhere. And another friend of mine, this one from NYU, had also started his own company in selling semiconductors. It was a marketing company. He was a physicist also. But it was a marketing company, and he said, get your own company.
Okay. I'd like to pause, and you told me a story earlier about that I just think's interesting. If you could just squeeze it in here.
What is this story?
About when they shut down the Elecom, and just go home, how a couple of people took the computers, got an agreement to
yeah,
take
well,
them.
that's one of the things that happened. What happened was that the people at Underwood didn't know anything about computers at all. Of course, that was known by the people who were Elecom, which was the company they had bought, and. There were a few people in it. There were actually three: Milt Schwartz and Saul Mamba, and somebody else. I don't remember at the moment his name. I didn't know him well. They went to Underwood, and they said, "You have these machines on the floor. Some of them are finished. Some of them are not finished." He said, "We will ourselves finish them, and we'll ourselves take them to the city, and we want them for nothing." And the people at Underwood were so glad to have somebody who would take all these enormous machines and ship them to the city and so on, that they said fine. And they gave them all the machines that they had, which these guys, who were both hardware people, machine hardware people, and a lot of them software people, they decided, they took the machines, they brought them to New York City, and what they did was rent them out. So somebody had a problem that they wanted to solve on a computer, they would do the software. These problems were not big deals. They were just massive amounts of data going back and forth. Mostly, they started renting time on the machine on the computers, which they had. They had 3 or 4 of them, and doing work for people outside. And remember, there weren't many computers in 1957, or programmers. There were certainly very few really good programmers, as these people were. Mm-hmm. So they made a fair amount of money on that, and within a few years, not very long at all, a company came in and asked to buy the company, and he bought the company, and they all made some millions of dollars, which to them was really unbelievable, because most of them had been very poor.
Yeah. Okay.
And then actually, Milt Schwartz had an idea for designing a system that would act as a printer of newspapers and magazines. And the system was essentially, the idea was to use a CRT and make it such high resolution that you could use a CRT that was maybe 6 inches diameter and get a resolution that would print a newspaper page. Now, Milt Schwartz was not a good enough engineer to do that, because now we're talking about really electronic design at a very basic level.
Right.
But Saul Mamba was. He was a very smart guy, and although his job was programming, he had a very good electrical engineering. Had spent 14 years in the Navy, doing work for the Navy, and he knew how to. And he actually was the guy who did most of the design, and they did build that machine. I forgot the name. I think the name of the country was Anaren or something like that, of the company they built. And Mitch did a lot of the work originally in his house. This is after they had sold their business, yes, and they had some money. And Mitch and Saul spent a couple of years essentially in a back room somewhere designing the system, and making it work. And they set up a company then, got some money from themselves. I think most of the money they put in themselves. There were only a few people designing it, and only a few people needed it, and they had enough money to live on, so they were okay. And that is the way all printing is done now.
Wow. Okay.
They had the patents on it. They got all the patents on it.
Really?
Yes, they got a contract with IBM to build that kind of a printer as output from one of their computers. And once they got that contract from IBM, their stock went to heaven. When was this? This was in the early 60s, I think.
Okay.
And they made an enormous amount of money on it. I mean, they made really a fortune.
Wow.
They sold the
Very
company.
interesting.
Isn't that nice?
Okay.
And it was
That's
very
a great
interesting
story.
because essentially the problem is an analog problem. Because the problem wasn't the software or a lot of that it was really engineering
Yes.
of resolution and the accuracy of positioning, of being able to position pieces of paper so they would all end up in the matching each other
Yes.
and being in essentially the same place, particularly for things like color. Anyway, that's their story.
Oh,
and so
very-
there were this whole bunch of poor boys who made a fortune.
Okay.
And they ended up living on Fifth Avenue.
All right. So back to them giving you advice, or Milt giving you advice.
But during that, yeah, this was in the 60s. It was really right after, while they were working at Anaren, and I think afterward. I don't remember the exact time that they sold it out. I can't remember, but it was somewhere in the 60s. And they were telling me, start a company. Milt Schwartz used to say, you know, you're smarter than I am. Start a company. And so that, I realized, and I certainly had a lot of experience about that because I had said I had never changed my fundamental position in the job. I started in it and I ended in it when I worked for other people. So I did come to the conclusion that the only way out was to start a company.
Okay.
And I worked with the two other people at Digitronics. Ed Wolf, who was a head of engineering there, and a guy named Anthony Morrow, who was one of the marketing people.
Okay.
It was very different marketing from what we ended up with, but he was very capable. And we started to say, well, what are we going to make? And so we actually didn't start sort of with an idea that somebody had and said, we want to take this public. We started with saying, we're going to start a company. What are we going to do?
Okay.
Quite different from what most people
Yes.
do. And one of the things and we had a lawyer. Milt Schwartz had lawyers there, and we used them as people who would give us some help and sort of analyze what we were thinking about. One of the big things we really thought of doing was building a cash register. And we came to the conclusion, really at our lawyers talked to us about that and said, NCR is so big, and NCR is concentrating on cash registers. If there's a competitor, they got to get rid of them.
Yes.
So the thing to do was, he said, that's not a good situation to be in. And we thought about that and decided that was probably true. But almost everything in the electronics business that we knew was competitive with IBM.
Yes.
You couldn't not be.
Right.
The biggest problem at IBM was that at one point they rented everything. And rental required a lot of cash.
Absolutely.
So we thought we had to find something where we did not need to rent. And we came to a conclusion that turned out not to be true. It was a little mistake. We thought about word processing. Now, I knew that IBM made a machine called the MTST, which was had been used for some years for what we now call word processing, but it was very limited, and it was really built specifically for the kind of company that is a company making aircraft, where they had specs and they had to update them constantly and change them constantly, and there was a whole lot of instructions needed, and these companies, did massive typing and retyping all the time.
Right.
And so they built this MTST, which was essentially built for that kind of industry, and it was made of essentially relays and I've forgotten the name of it. It's a tube, which is a specialized tube that runs with relay, a thermionic tube.
Oh, thyratrons. Thyrotrons?
Thyrotrons, right. Thank you. I couldn't remember the name.
Okay.
Thyrotrons.
Yes.
It's been a long time since I said that word. So they were using Thyrotrons, and it was really, you know, what we thought of. It was a klutzy machine, and very different. I don't know that it's difficult to use, but it didn't do much except that particular job. And we thought that since MOS chips were just beginning to be known, although they weren't yet available, we thought it would be possible to build an electronic driven system that would be cheap enough to sell as a standalone system. Now, small computers were available, but people really, at the time we started, which was in 1968, 1969, nobody really had any you know, desk-type computers that you could just write a program for word processing. I know that seems the obvious thing now, but it really wasn't then.
Yeah, PDP-8 was the cheapest thing
and
there was at that time.
How much did that cost? Do you remember?
Well, when it first came out, it was $18,500 for it and a teletype
machine to get output.
Teletype 33 to get output, input, output, everything. And they did, you know, as they came with newer models, they did reduce the price. The PDP-8S, I don't think the PDP-8S was out yet. It eventually they sold that for $10,000.
But that wasn't, you couldn't build a secretarial stand and sell it.
No,
you had to add
the
printer.
Point is, there's no high quality printer yet.
No, well, a typewriter. That's really the only printer that would do it. And
I know. A teletype wasn't going to do it.
No.
Yeah.
No.
So I understand. There just wasn't enough there.
It wasn't there.
It wasn't there. I agree.
And so you needed to do a lot to get to something that really felt like, it has to feel like a typewriter.
The secretary has to think, I like typing
I like
on
the
this.
typewriters. Yes, I like this. And they would be frightened of it, very frightened of it.
Yes.
I didn't realize how frightened of it they were.
Okay, that became another problem.
That became another problem. And I used to be teased a lot by all the people around me because I couldn't type.
Yes.
I mean, you didn't learn to type in school then.
Of course.
They never taught. I mean, as you know, they didn't teach you to type.
Right.
So if you were taking physics, this is what you did.
Yes.
Anyway, so I had to stay far away from looking like a secretary. Well, let me just get my
your thoughts together.
my stuff again. Anyway, so we sat down and we thought that there was another thing. IBM had started to sell machines. That was a big thing for us because, first of all, they had very high prices of everything they sold. It was higher than what other people did. They always had very high margins. I don't think that's true anymore, but that's what they had then. And I think that's one of the reasons why they had these rentals, and they made a fortune on rentals because the people used the machines for a very long time. And then the Supreme Court, they had a long antitrust trial, very long, and they finally agreed. Part of the antitrust contract was that they would sell the machines.
Yes.
And that said to us, that's a hole there that we can use, because if they're going to sell machines, they'll probably sell word processors if they ever come into the market. And if they sell word processors of any kind, and we didn't think they could move as fast as we could, that it would be, they would sell them and they'd be expensive. So this is a safe place to go. It turned out that they actually, and I think they did it to get us out of the business. I mean, to hurt us. They did actually rent the machines for a while, and we then had to rent the machines, and that became a really big financial problem for us, devastating financial problem. So let me go back to the design. MOS chips were available. One of the big problems was memory, and we think we could get around that, and because there were two companies very near us, General Instrument and Standard Microsystems, that were building MOS chips.
Okay.
General Instrument, I think, was first, although I have read that the Texas company,
TI.
Texas Instrument, that they were the first. But I don't believe that. I don't believe that's true.
Okay.
I think we did it first.
All right.
Myself,
I don't know.
and we were so small, nobody noticed it.
Right.
And Ed Wolf, who was the head of engineering, and he was one of the best engineers I ever met in my life. And he decided that this had to be very compact and very inexpensive, and that it was going to be a small box and we were going to use magnetic tape. And in those days, there was used for audio applications, music, whatever. There were little tapes. They came in a cartridge about this big, and they were two small tapes.
Yeah.
Which you used for
They
audio.
were quarter-inch cassette tapes?
Yeah, cassette
Is that what you're
tape.
talking about?
Ordinary
Yeah, so of course
cassette
I
tapes.
remember those.
Well, I was explaining because I thought some of the people in your museum would not have remembered
Would not remember that
Would not
part.
remember that. That's quite a while ago that these were really commonly used.
Yes.
So, so we decided that those were going to be our memory. And
Okay.
we had two cassette tapes. One was an input tape, if you might want to use an input tape, and then you would edit it. So again, it was serial.
Yes.
That is a problem, and of course later word processors fixed that. But most of the time it was not a problem for people using typewriters. Now, secretaries worked on one project at a time and went through it. And you didn't have to retrieve from a large number of places.
Right.
It was essentially a serial application.
Right.
So it never really bothered the user.
Mm-hmm.
And we were pretty sure that that would be true. And I wrote the specs.
Okay. Yes.
And Ed Wolf decided that he could make himself, we could design these MOS chips. He had talked to General Instrument and to these other people, and it was possible. And at that point, most of the MOS chips that were being designed were indeed special purpose chips, because that's
Custom,
where the
yeah.
world was.
Yes.
And so he figured out that he could build 13 chips, the 13 design chips, and I don't know, I don't remember how much, I think maybe 100 transistors on a chip. Now, at the same time, I should have told you this before, but Intel had started in 1968. We started in 1969.
Yes.
And so we were very close, and Intel had already been around for a short time. And we called them, and we knew they were building a little computer. And that was the first choice. We were going to buy the computer chip from them. And they said no, they would not be ready for years, for a while. I think they were planning to be out in '72. This was '69. We couldn't wait.
Okay.
And I really should have started telling you that, because that's what compelled us to say we were going to build it all in chips and all ourselves.
Yes.
And we farmed out a few of them to General Instrument. That was all they could do at a time, a few chips at a time. We farmed out about 3 or 4 chips to General Instrument, a couple of them to Standard Microsystems. We had the spec. We designed it on paper, and they built them.
Okay.
And then we had one guy who we I don't know, somehow taught. I think they must have learned it by going to to one of those companies and finding and learning how to make them. And they designed the chips, another few chips. So between the 13 chips, between these 3 groups, we got them designed in less than a year.
Okay.
Maybe 7 or 8 months a piece, all of them.
Wow.
We designed those chips.
You're kidding.
Now, if you look, I looked yesterday. I took a look at Intel. There's a history of Intel around, and they have pictures of the 404 and the
8008.
8008. That's
Yeah,
right.
was the original one.
And they have actual photos of what they were, and they were much more condensed than what we did.
Yes.
But we didn't have time for that. I mean, they took a long time to divide it, and they had a lot of people working for them. And they were trying to make a machine, something they could sell to everybody.
As a chip.
As a chip.
Yes.
And we were trying to build something to build a machine that we
Right.
were going to sell. And so what was on the chip didn't matter. We also had an advantage in that we knew that the machine was going to be operated by a person, and therefore it was slow. It did not have to function fast. And so we could cut down the size of what we were doing by doing everything sequentially.
Yes.
That is, by operating on it a bit at a time, serially, instead of in parallel.
Yes, okay.
Almost all by the time chips were coming in, people were all working in parallel, because
Right.
they had to get speed in order to be competitive. But we didn't have that problem.
Okay.
We could be slow.
So you could be bit serial.
And if we were bit serial, we could do things much more simply. We didn't have a lot of chips around holding memory in electronic form.
Yes.
And we could go back and forth to memory. Now, fortunately, the invention at MIT of magnetic memory came in the nick of time, because
Okay.
that would have been a big problem. So we used magnetic memory.
So you had a core memory.
We had a core memory.
Got it.
And we had,
A little one, or?
I'm trying to remember. I really can't remember. I somehow can't remember what the core. It
I
wasn't
bet
very.
your designer. I bet he might.
I
Remember.
bet he would remember.
Okay.
It wasn't very. It didn't have to be very big.
Yeah, of course.
Because really, the memory was really on tape.
Yes.
Automatically
exactly.
on tape.
Yeah.
What you really needed was a lot of RAM.
Okay.
You needed the fixed memory. We didn't want to do it in RAM. That was really expensive in those days.
Yes, of course.
RAM was very expensive, so we had a small memory on the computer that was RAM, and a substantial ROM memory.
Okay.
But it was a programmed machine, and if we wanted to have a new model, you could just reprogram it, and you'd have a different RAM, and that's
Reprogram the
it.
ROM, and you were.
And you couldn't afford to have money changes anyway, because you had field service to handle. You had to have instructions as to how to use the machine. You had to have people who were the secretaries themselves had to be instructed in how to
Right.
use it. You couldn't have very
Right.
much variation.
Yes.
and have a big company. And we were, by the time we started manufacturing, we were already selling in Germany and England and so on.
Okay.
We had a world market. We were selling in Australia, in New Zealand,
Wow.
not China.
Yeah.
Couldn't get into China. But we sold all throughout Europe. And our biggest market was actually Germany, who used the machine to its limits. They were the best users of technical equipment, best trained, best service that we saw
Okay.
at that time. And we sold a lot of machines in Germany.
Okay.
Let me just check what I have, to see what I have left out, if I have left out anything. Now, to do this, we had to build a plant.
Okay.
And a guy I had known in one of the previous companies, just a minute, I have some notes here. A guy I knew had suggested a guy who could be head of manufacturing, and he had bags of experience manufacturing. He was really never went to school. He was one of those guys who had grown up manufacturing equipment, and he knew the whole business very well.
Okay.
And in fact, we had a number of of people who had never gone to college, engineers who had never gone to college,
Yeah.
Manufacturing experts who had never gone to college. It was still a world where people learned on their way through companies and were very capable.
Okay.
And he was the one who found our first building, which was in Hauppauge, Long Island,
Okay.
which I think is roughly 50 miles out from New York City.
Very close to Digitronics or not?
No, I don't think they were very close.
Okay.
On
Just
Long
curious.
Island. They weren't.
All right.
But it was further out than
Then
Digitronics was.
Okay.
And I was commuting from New York, remember? It was not a situation, which is the usual situation, where the company is built where the president lives, where
Right.
the founder lives.
Yes.
No.
Which has almost no logic associated
Absolutely
with it.
none. The logic of this was 20,000 square feet, and I'm trying to remember, it cost about $25,000 a year rent. I mean, it was cheap.
Yes.
But remember, this is the end of 1969, the beginning of 1970.
Okay.
We were falling into a terrible recession.
Yes.
That was a big problem,
Yes.
the recession.
Exactly.
It was.
Isn't quite there yet, but it's coming.
Well, the one we just had in the 1908. I mean 28 was the last one was pretty bad.
Yes.
But partly because it lasted so long. But the one we had interest rates of 16%. There was a big inflation. Remember?
Yes.
Do you remember this?
I absolutely remember that.
In 1970s, the 1960s was a wild, abandoned kind of economy,
Yeah.
and then starting in the early 70s, we got this terrible inflation, which lasted all through the 70s.
Exactly.
We got 12%, 14, 16, 18.
Right.
I'll tell you, I was going to tell you this later, but when we got to the point where we found out that we could not live without renting the machine because the people were so used to renting everything that that's all they could think of.
Yes.
It was not so much competition with IBM at the beginning. They didn't have any competition because they didn't build machines until later.
Yes.
But the problem was people wanted to rent. That was what they did. And they didn't have a system in which they could spend, and we charged, our manufacturing cost was about $2,400 for the whole system, including the typewriter and everything.
Yep.
And which was very little.
Yes.
Because you opened it and there was one PC board and that was it, and a power supply.
Yes.
That's all you saw. The power supply probably cost more than the board.
Right.
Which is not uncommon.
Yeah.
And what's not uncommon is that the frame costs more than the board, PC board. But we were pressed by the way people were used to working, and that began to eat up cash, which became a very serious problem over some time.
Right.
Let me just take a look at this and see if I've missed anything.
Could you possibly talk about a little bit more about how you financed the company?
Oh, at the beginning.
Yeah, at the beginning, how you financed it. You know, how many people was the core group until you had to get into manufacturing? How did you do sales? Did you have distributors? Did you have direct sales? You know, talk to me about a few of the business aspects.
Let me answer the last thing. In terms of the structure, we never wanted to have a bunch of our own salesmen. We were too small at the beginning.
Okay, of course.
What we had were agents, and there were agents all over the world, in this country as well as mostly, and certainly in many others, where there were people who sold office supplies.
Ah. Okay.
So we did have a marketing. I told you the three people who left Digitronics to start this company were me as president, Anthony Morrow, who was the marketing guy for Digitronics, headed marketing for Digitronics, and Ed Wolf, who was the engineer.
Okay.
And some friends. Well, Milt Schwartz was the guy who had started a little VC group with a bunch of friends of his who had invested in some of the things he had done, and he was the guy who started. I think it was, I can't remember the name exactly, Anaran, the printing company.
Yes.
And he made a lot of money, and he said that if I started a company, he would put money in, and that's the way we started.
And how much did he put in?
$750,000, which was, which I don't know what you do to try to get it to what it's worth now.
You use the consumer price index. I can do that. It's just math.
I think it's got to be about a factor of 10. I mean, just at a guess. Yeah. I mean, there was a very high inflation during the 70s and into the 80s, and I really think there was but by now, something like that, to give people do need some understanding of what the relationship is, because they look at this idea and they and I give them numbers. It doesn't make sense to anybody of this generation.
Yes. All right.
And I remember, because I immediately got health care for the people. I knew that I had, in order to get health care, you needed 10 people, or you couldn't get it in a company. And I remember that well because we only had 9 people. So we made up a name, and we put it in, and gave a salary and everything, and gave them 10 names.
Okay.
We walked into that building, which was 20,000 square feet. It was enormous for 9 people, but it was so cheap. I mean, as I think I told you, it was about $25,000 a year for 20,000 square feet.
Wow.
Walk and a half.
That's incredible, but okay.
Well, there was also the beginnings of a very serious depression, or recession as they called it then, which happened at the beginning of the 1970s, and by 1974 was a disaster.
Correct.
In a company that was renting machines and the bigger we got, the more cash we needed. More of that later.
Okay.
Now you asked about how do we start. Milt Schwartz put the $750,000 in, and we used that to start the company with, as I said, 9 people. We found one secretary, who was in the previous company that had just moved out, and we hired her immediately, and she was wonderful. Okay. So she just stayed in the same place, a different company, and we hired her, and we hired a head of manufacturing. And the reason we did that right then and there was that we had a schedule that said we had to get this out in a year and a half or so. Yeah. And if you're going to do that, you better get your manufacturing all set up. Running right away. So my friends who were on the board and who given us the money, or invested, I should say, the money, said, you better get a manufacturing guy. Now, apart from everything else, you need to know how to manufacture it so it can be put together. So you need that person in the research department also.
Yes.
And we believed that, and we hired this great guy who was all practicality. He knew just how to do everything.
Wonderful.
He was great to do that. We were running out of money, and it was hard to get money, and it became even harder. But Milton knew somebody who was in a company that was operating as an investment bank, and well, they were really brokers, and we needed a bridge, so we got a bridge from him again of another $500,000 about a year later, and we kept going, and then we got our first investment, and I have it just a minute. I wrote it down somewhere. I think I have it here. And we got money from an offering, which was actually a debt in the form of a debt, in the form of some equity plus debt.
Okay.
Of about it was not very much money, about another. I think it was about $4 million.
Okay.
And that kept us for a while. And then we got this offering, which was in stock of another $4 million.
You went public, yes.
I figured out, and we went public, and here is the public offering. And when I figured it out yesterday, the total amount of money we got was about $10 million.
Okay.
And when you think that we built a worldwide marketing network, we built a whole new plant. I mean, we had to get the whole plant started to manufacture. And over a couple of years, we ended up with 500 people. We had just a little under 500 people.
At your peak?
At our peak.
Now,
Well,
I don't think you've actually said on tape the name of the company.
Oh, yes. Well, the name of the company was lovely because we didn't know what to name it, and none of us had ever studied English.
Yes.
But my husband, who was born in England and who spoke beautifully and had a wide vocabulary, sat down and he figured out that the name ought to be Redactron. And the reason for that is the word redact means, in every language you can imagine, edit, to edit.
Ah.
To redact a document is to edit it.
Ah.
In English, in French, in German, in Russian. My husband checked every place.
Yes, okay.
And he got a word that was commonly used almost all over the world.
Wonderful. Exactly.
He
So
was so-
people,
he
so
was
the name
so
of the
good at
company
that.
tells you what you do.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
He was so good at that stuff.
Yeah.
Like, he used to do the New York Times puzzle in 10 minutes. I mean,
Oh my
he
God.
timed himself.
Oh.
He was just great, very smart, and,
Okay,
and
clearly.
with a great memory. But anyway, he was the one who
Came up with the name.
Came up with the name
Very good,
Redactron.
good.
And you didn't even know what it meant, did you?
No, of course not.
No, you didn't know the word redact?
Yes, now that you say it, I think of it I think it's used for classified information when they redact the document.
Yeah.
They just black out certain
Yeah, that's
words.
redact,
Yeah, I think that's redact.
But isn't it perfect?
Yes, it's perfect.
Perfect, and I certainly didn't know that it was that same name in so many languages.
Of course I didn't. Very good.
Okay, so that's
That's
story, which I'm sorry I forgot.
That's okay.
But we had that name when we started.
Okay, good.
And then the other thing I did was I had a friend that I'd known since I was an adolescent,
Yeah.
who did PR.
All
A
right.
woman, Roz Willett, her name was, and I knew she was very smart, very capable, and she'd done it for years. And so I asked her if she could be do PR. I knew somehow, I don't know where, that doing PR, where you hire somebody to get your name in the papers, is a much more efficient way of advertising than advertising.
Mm-hmm.
That you could get known faster that way. And I think Roz may have told me that, because I just talked to her the other day.
Okay.
And and so I think we spent $2,000 a month on PR, and we got a lot of PR.
Yes.
And the whole company became really well known through there were articles in all magazines about it.
Wow.
And a lot of it had to do with the fact that there was a woman running it.
Yes.
And she took advantage of that as much as she could.
Okay.
She was very smart about
She's
it.
very good.
Yeah.
All right.
So we got a PR person. We did that all very quickly. And a lot of these were just from friends and friends of friends and friend of who's the best person for this and who's the best person for that.
Okay.
And and over the years, I wasn't a kid by that time.
Yes, of course.
This is in, let's say, 1970. I would have been 45.
Yes.
So
had a lot of
remember, I
experience.
had been working in this field from the time I left school, and I had never gotten out of the first job I had.
Yes.
It tells you, again, so I was just paralyzed there. There was no other place I could go to because the next job would have been a high-level job.
Yeah. Okay.
So I made myself president.
Very good.
I said we had $10 million over this period, but what we did, the bank, you know, the Bank of Boston.
Well, let me just, yes, can I just interrupt for a second?
Of course.
So you had a peak, your peak sales were in the neighborhood of $20 million revenue?
No, they weren't, because they turned out to be mostly in rental.
Ah.
Now you can look at the numbers in there. I forgot what they really were. Maybe
Okay,
just about
I'll look
8 or
at the numbers
9.
then.
Because what you have to do with the rentals is you have to build them up over
Exactly.
5 or 10 years.
It's an
and
annuity.
then it's wonderful. It's an
wonderful.
annuity.
Yes.
But if you keep proper books, many people in those days used to just capitalize it and put it down as revenue. But that was stupid because the cash flow wasn't there.
Yeah, right.
So we did it in a very...
In the right way.
We always worked very accurately in accordance with good practice.
Okay.
And I hired a guy who had a fairly high-level job in New York City. And I can't remember, somebody else recommended him to me. I know. This wasn't done by the usual ways. It was done hand to hand, from friend to friend.
Yeah.
And they knew this guy who had a high-level job at Revlon in finance.
Yeah.
And had 4 little boys
Okay.
as kids, and was commuting from out in Long Island, and wanted a job near his home. He came to work for us.
And he was.
And he came to work for us, but he was really experienced. And
Yeah.
and you must remember that at this point, I had never seen a financial piece of paper in my life.
Okay. Okay.
And he sat down and he taught me accounting. Just taught me, got the books, got there, and told me. And I'll tell you this now, that years later, the president of Burroughs,
Yes.
and a guy who worked for him, but started a little company, and I was on the board of it. This was the kind of thing I did then. We were looking for money, and we wanted to put up a little accounting system showing the expected P&L and the expected
right.
operation statement, the expected
Yeah, your
balance
little
sheet.
business plan.
And he didn't know how to do it. And I sat down and did all the accounting, made it, did it all formally the way an accountant would do it. And we had it for the presentation. Because I had a teacher.
Right, and he didn't.
And he didn't.
Very good. One other question that I'll ask right now is, you started the company. What month did you actually leave Digitronic Systems?
December of 1969.
Okay, and when did you shipped your first?
We shipped our first machine. And I'm happy to say that it's in the perspective.
Yes.
So the prospectus, so that I can be sure about it. That we shipped it here. It says, the company began manufacturing the product in September of 1971, and through September 15th, 1972, had produced and shipped approximately 1,020 units, of which 596 had been sold, 176 had been rented, and of course that increased in time. 194 were on consignment to all the agencies who were selling them.
Yes, had to have demos.
They had demos. They all had demos. And 54 were in transit for sale and rental.
Very good.
That's in 1 year.
Wow.
And that's
you shipped
that's in
18 months after.
18 months after we opened the door with 9 people.
Yes. Very good. Pretty good.
That was very good.
Yes.
When I look at it now, it looks even better.
That's right. All right. So let's-
and that I have to say is largely Ed Wolf.
Yes.
I told you he was a
Just a
superb
brilliant
engineer. He knew just what was important and he knew what was not important.
Okay.
And he knew about costs. I mean, he
knew everything a great
that
engineer
needed
needs to know.
Does.
Yeah.
And he was wonderful.
Okay.
And I say this because he died very young, and
Yeah.
he died just a few years after that.
Oh my
Yeah, he was-
goodness. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
now we go. So
No, you were
now
talking
you're
about
being
finance.
Yeah.
You were talking about financing, and I think I've told you that now that we raised through various ways
Yeah.
about $10 million
Right.
over a period of a few years, and what I didn't tell you was that we had a relationship with the Bank of Boston. The Bank of Boston was a bank that saw itself as funding a lot of new startup companies. They had been very successful in Boston doing that, so they set up a group in New York to do it.
Okay.
And I think our guy, since we were on Long Island, we had a Boston guy
Yeah.
who was our relationship who worked with us, and we ended up, because we were doing rentals, we ended up borrowing $11 million.
Okay.
And by that time, it was 1974, and the economy just fell out of bed. And as I said, interest rates were going up. And when interest rates were at 16%, we had to. Was costing us 23% for money for a rental.
Wow.
And you cannot make a living on that.
Yes.
You cannot make a living when your interest rate is 23%.
Yeah.
And so we were really, because of the economy, which it was falling into a terrible recession. I think it was worse than the one in 2008. Honestly, I know what the numbers say, but I think that's because we were a bigger economy. But the economy was just awful, and we were lucky in a way that we had all this German business.
Yes.
Which was developed very quickly by Anthony, who had already had a lot of agents in his past history, had worked all over the world,
Mm-hmm.
and knew a lot of people and so on, could set it up very quickly,
Okay.
and did set it up very quickly. But the pressure of money, it was at the end. We had gotten 10 million, which we had spent, and we were living on the bank.
Yes.
And that cannot go on forever.
Right.
And we realized, well, what happened was actually that it isn't just that we realized. The bank came to us and said they couldn't go on. We had to do something.
All right.
And it turned out that the bank had a company, knowing that the bank was our bank, went to Boston Bank and asked if they could be introduced by the bank to us because they wanted to buy the company.
Okay.
And that was another accident because we were just trying to get more money from the bank.
Right.
That's what we were trying to do. Incidentally, I should have said that the economy was so bad that it was impossible to get money on the market.
Yeah.
Certainly for a small startup company.
Oh,
It was
yeah.
impossible.
No, you could not go to the market.
You could not
in
go to the
74.
market in '74 and get money.
Right.
It was, and I should have said that first. That
Yep.
the only possibility for us was the bank, who really were very good to us,
Okay.
and recognized that we had really done some, I think, spectacular work in designing this machine, getting it out quickly, designing everything ourselves, and so on. Before I leave, I'm sorry, I'm going back to things, but before I leave this, I want to tell you something about this machine in terms of its position at the time.
Yes.
At the time, and I particularly want to tell you that since we couldn't get the chip from Intel, and we designed our own chip, computer processor chip. That chip could be designed very differently from what was current technology, because we didn't have a high requirement for speed. And so we designed that chip to be a serially operated chip.
Okay.
In other words, the calculation was done not as each number as a number which you did in parallel with other numbers, but you designed it as bit by bit as the sequence went along. You did your adding, subtracting.
Yeah, you had a
all the
one-bit
arithmetic
adder.
measures. So it was a one-bit adder.
Right.
And that made the design of the chip. It made it possible to put everything on a single chip.
Yes.
Which we could do, and have it cheap.
Yeah.
I mean, when you started to do it in parallel, the cost of the manufacturing was much higher, and so we did this. It was fully workable. It did everything that any other calculator in the world could do.
Right.
But it did it slowly.
Yes.
And we took that to get the expense out of the machine, and it worked.
Okay.
As I said, $2,400 for everything, including the magnetic tapes, including the printer, including everything, was
Yeah,
our
wow.
factory cost.
Yeah.
That was pretty low.
That's very low. I agree.
And so, and actually, I should say, in later years when we had to sell the company and we sold it to Burroughs, we were the most efficient manufacturing operation in the entire United States in terms of the amount of work we turned out every year.
Good.
So, is there anything else about, we talked about finance. I think did we cover all of this?
It was
now?
all MOS. I'm sure it was P-channel chips.
I really don't
it would
remember.
be. From General Instrument in that era, that's what it would be.
Well, that's what they did.
P-channel MOS,
I mean, it was very early in MOS. It was one of the first, it had to be one of the first
71
machines
is very early. Absolutely.
for MOS chips.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay.
I think it had to be whatever they were making at that time.
Good.
Is there anything else? That's technical. Is there any other technical things you would be interested in?
You know, I'll probably think of some things, but
Well, the point I wanted to make about this one was that it was a serial chip, but it was a full processor
Computer.
doing everything.
yes.
And we got it out in September. We know we actually delivered product, usable product, in September of 1971 because we've got the record. I really didn't remember
the dates are
whether
hard
it was
to remember,
71
yeah.
too, but it's 71.
I think that's very interesting.
What has been said in the past in this country or everywhere is that it was Intel who put out the first processor in 71.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure that it wasn't
Well,
our company.
we have the records because we have the oral history of the 4004 project team. And so we can verify, when they had the first working chip, when they delivered the first chips to the calculator company, because they first delivered 4004s to the Japanese calculator company because it was a contract.
Yeah.
And I don't know when, but we can look it up.
Yeah.
And then they delivered it, then they offered them for general sale and delivered them to the,
So it may
general
be
public.
earlier than I thought.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll let you know when I find out.
Yeah, I
Okay, because I bet you're curious. I'm curious too.
All these years, Ed Richards, who actually was the guy who did the design, and I have wondered about whether we really were first.
You were very close if you weren't.
Yeah.
And certainly independently. I mean, you didn't look at what they did.
It had nothing to. It was done by a completely different technique.
And
I mean, it was serial. It wasn't even parallel the way they were.
And you would have come up. You would have put, just because of your background, you would have put a computer controlling it.
Of course.
Because that's what you knew how to do.
We knew how to do general purpose computers. And
You'd done many of
that whole
them.
system, which was the computer chip, the memory, and all the connections to the input-output systems, was exactly the same as every other computer in the world.
Yes.
Being built.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a total computer, and the whole thing was programmable in every
Oh,
respect.
Okay, good.
So that's the way it was.
Do you know whether you happen to have any logic diagrams or instruction manuals for the computer.
I do have some form of instruction. I have it in this pile of stuff I have. I'll show it to you.
We'll look at that afterwards.
Yes, I have a full. I don't know exactly. I haven't read what the documentation covers, how much it covers.
I'll look at that.
But I was surprised to find it in my files because I normally didn't keep that kind of file.
All right. Well, that's
and
good.
Ed Richards, if anybody has the logic designs, Ed Richards would have. I think he told me that he really didn't have anything left.
Yeah, he may have thrown everything
hadn't
away.
kept them.
All
So
right.
I don't think that stuff is available. I'm sorry.
All right.
Now, again, can you think of anything else?
No.
Do you want to hear anything about what happened after this?
Yes, I want to hear the rest of the Redacton story, but then I'm probably running out of time because I have to pack up too.
Well, I think the Redacton story is easy to say. We were told by the bank that we had to get some money somewhere, and if not, we had to sell the company, and they had somebody they knew who was interested already.
And so who was this?
Burroughs.
Oh, okay.
Now, Burroughs had come to them. The guy who was doing the work was a retired guy that was on the board. He worked at Burroughs, and he was chief financial officer. And they asked him to go and look into it. And he brought some technical people. And and we had a meeting in New York City at somewhere at a lawyer's office. And one of the guys he brought was a guy I had known from in a previous life. I mean, I'd met him somewhere, and we were friendly and so on. So we knew each other. And that turned out to be a big plus, because when you know somebody, can you trust them or you can't.
Yeah, exactly.
And I felt the same way about him.
Yeah, all right.
So we got along very well, and then we had a negotiation, and by that time, of course, our stock was down at 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we sold it for, I think it was $10 a share, something 8 or 10, something like that. We sold it for a lot more than that, but we certainly didn't get the money that it
should have.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And so, how many shares did you? Do you remember what it added up to in terms of
what I made?
$10 a share?
No,
at $10 a share times the total number of shares.
I think it ended up.
What the value was?
Remember, we also owed $11 million.
Yeah, I see. You have to subtract.
So it was $11 million plus, I think, $15 million. It was worth a total about $25 million.
Okay. Okay. All right.
And that was and considering that everybody was going bankrupt in 1974.
It's a lot better than zero, which is what happens when you're bankrupt.
Well,
stock goes down to zero.
Most of the small companies like us went bankrupt at that time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lots of them, lots and lots of them. We were very lucky.
Well, you had a valuable asset.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, what did Burroughs do with this company?
The answer really is nothing. I mean,
there's sort of a story there, isn't there, about how you?
I left. I thought it was better if Burroughs got one of their people to run it.
Yes.
And what I wanted to do was get into Burroughs, and they had a product planning department. I thought I'd like to get into the product planning department and see how big I'd never worked for a big company.
Yeah.
And see how a big company worked and so on. And I found it really shocking, just shocking. What they did, their product planning company, a group, consisted entirely of marketing people. Now, the president of the company was a marketing guy, and he was a very good one, and he really had a great feeling for technology, an interest in technology, and he got good technology people, and they really made their got their market, because what they did very early in the game, at the advice of the guy who was running the design department, was to write everything in high-level languages, and do it very efficiently, very quickly, very accurately, because you could provide a lot of testing if it's all written at high level.
Right.
And nothing in
machine.
The low-level languages,
Nothing.
which is what people weren't doing was that all their operating systems and everything were being written in
machine language. Absolutely.
Absolutely,
in that era.
because it was fast.
Yeah.
You wanted to be able to run it fast.
And memory cost a lot. So it made it
So
small,
that's what you did.
quote unquote.
They did not do that because they said the way to do it accurately and completely and without errors and was to operate at high-level languages and take the beating.
Okay.
And there was one guy there who that was his idea. He sold it to the president. They did it, and they had very successful machines. They had good operating systems, good software, and so on. And they essentially sold it because they provided services. They had a very good service department. They had been in business for 100 years.
Yes.
You know, started with calculators.
Right.
And so they because of that, they did very well under this name I forgot, McDonald. McDonald, that was his name.
Yes, right.
McDonald. Do you remember his name?
I remember that name.
Yeah.
Now, who was the technical guy? Was it Bob Barton or not?
No, Bob Barton was the guru.
He
He
acted
was the
as
guru, and he went around and looked at things, and he was very smart and very interesting to have around. He didn't do anything.
Okay. Got it.
He essentially advised people, and he thought and commented on what people were doing. He was very good for the company.
Yes.
I don't think at that time he even worked for the company.
Yeah,
he was
okay.
kind of
He probably retired by then,
a consultant to the company.
Okay.
It was somebody else who did it, and I have his face in front of me, but I can't remember his
That's
name.
fine.
But he was terrible for us because he immediately insisted that everything for the word processor be done in high-level languages. Now, we had written programs, and we had done what everybody else did, wrote them. But our programs were fairly simple.
Yes.
You didn't have very complicated things. And because our machines were slow, we couldn't do that.
Yeah.
Well, he insisted, and Ed Richards, who was running it, was driven crazy. But I said, Ed, do what he says. He said he would fire Ed if he did anything different.
Yeah. Okay.
And so Ed wrote in high-level language, and you put a finger on the keyboard of the typewriter, of the keyboard. It was a separate keyboard by that time, a keyboard, and 5 seconds later it appeared on the screen.
Yeah.
And I couldn't convince the man that no, that's not the way to write for this particular special purpose machine.
Right.
And he said, you heard me, everybody in your company will be fired if they do anything else. I said, all right, we'll do it, your way.
Right.
But I didn't want to be there anymore.
Of course you wouldn't, because it wasn't rational.
It wasn't rational.
Yeah.
I told them that I would like to get out of it. They hired a guy who went there. They also decided they were immediately going to move because they didn't want to be in a state that had a union. We didn't have a union. I had fought. There were 3 different unions that tried to unionize my company, and I killed every one of them.
Okay.
I won every one. And we had the most efficient factory in the country. And they moved
Because there weren't any work rules, and you killed them by really taking care of the workers.
That's right.
And be good to them.
They had coffee.
They had free coffee.
They had free coffee.
Okay.
I have to tell you this. About 20 years later, I was in the train going to New York City from my house, and some guy comes up to me, my age, and he says, "Are you Evelyn Parison?" And I said, "Yeah." And he looked familiar to me. He said, "I worked in your company, and it was the best company I ever worked for."
Oh, isn't that nice?
Yeah.
That's
I
great
was very
to hear.
happy.
You should be.
Yeah.
You should be proud and
Oh,
happy.
yeah.
Very good.
Well, it was a good company when I worked for it too.
All right. Yes.
I liked it. We had a great time.
All right.
And the biggest problem was we just didn't have enough money to build it into a real company.
Yeah. A long
You
time.
needed enough company. You needed enough money for to essentially be able to finance the rental business, and we hadn't even planned on it.
Yes.
And that was maybe stupid of us. But
yeah.
it was we just didn't have it, and then there was a depression.
Right.
And you couldn't get. I didn't think of it in a way because you could get before this in the '60s. You could get money.
Yes.
By the time we started, you couldn't.
Yes. Right.
We had a terrible time.
And reasonable
getting
interest, you know, just
it's
sort of.
luck. It's just luck. Wade, when did you start?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And the cash flow just didn't add up with those kinds of interest rates.
Okay, so let me go on. We went to Burroughs, and I found Burroughs. You know, I had a number of ideas for Burroughs, and I tried to talk to some of the other people about him, and they said, "Oh no, you can't do that for this. You can't do that." I think Burroughs would still be it would be a thriving company if they had listened to me.
Okay.
I'm saying that, and I don't think I'm puffing
right.
up myself,
Okay.
because I did have ideas that eventually turned out to be just the right ideas for that company, and and they never would listen to me, and I didn't figure out until maybe a couple of years ago. I'm a pretty slow learner. That was an all-boy company. I was the only woman who was at any level in there.
Yeah.
That all the people were marketing people, and they thought I didn't know anything.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially what it came about is they didn't want to listen to me.
Yeah.
They had no use for me at all. I was an outsider. I was an Easterner. They were all from the South.
Yeah.
I was, you know, I was not one of them, and they didn't want to hear from me. That's really what happened.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure that I could have saved that company from the demise.
From where it ended up.
From where it was. And then they bought my system, and they wouldn't listen to me about what to do with it. And what they did, actually, the only work they did was to take the ideas of word processor, and they put them on a standard terminal. I mean, a standard entry system.
Yes.
That was a terminal for a shared computer.
Yes.
Big computer in the center, and they shared it to the. Well, it wasn't successful.
Mm-hmm.
Secretaries are not used to using those machines.
Right. They need the terminal needs to have human interface.
And have a human interface that people could use for everybody.
Right.
And they just didn't understand the issues.
For being run by marketing people, that's very strange, isn't it?
Well, but they were marketing people for computer company.
That's true.
For computers, not for secretaries.
Yes.
And incidentally, I should say one other thing about that business in terms of marketing. You know what one of the biggest problems we had was that the most efficient way to use this in those days, partly because they were $8,000 machines, was in groups where people had a lot of typing, like lawyers' offices.
Yeah.
In central places where they were grouped together, and they would all work on heavily redone documents.
Exactly.
And there were lots of places to sell that. But the idea that a person who was a manager could give up his secretary because he could do it himself did not exist. And the men around did not want to use those machines in because they would lose they were afraid they would lose their secretary. And there was some possibility of that by the time the 70s were there.
Yes.
But it was interesting. It was an ego thing. And one of the hardest things to break was that ego situation between a guy and his secretary. The secretary was either removed where she'd work for a few people, because she could.
Yes.
Now, that was one of the points you made, that she could work for 2 or 3 people.
Right.
They didn't want that. They wanted their own secretary.
Yes.
That was a very tough problem in the United States. It was not a tough problem in Germany.
Really? Okay. That's interesting.
It was very
interesting.
I thought that was an interesting, from a cultural point of view, and how things change. Now everybody does their own typing.
Of course.
But it happened gradually over 20 years or so.
Right.
It didn't happen all at once in a flash.
Yes.
And it didn't. Even IBM, I think, had trouble doing that.
Yeah.
I think that's an important point to point out.
Yes.
Okay, so how much time do I have? Oh, you're going to have somebody at 5. Let me spend a few minutes on what happened afterwards.
Yes.
I told you about being at Burroughs. I stayed there a couple of years, and I began to realize that I was out of. There was no way I could make friends in that place.
Right.
And so I left in 1980.
Okay.
And what happened was that some fellow that Sol Mamba knew wanted to start a little venture fund, and I won't spend the time, but it was working on a little different purpose, in an organizational structure that was different from the standard way venture capitals work. And I have to say, I found out that it really financially wasn't useful. It should have been organized differently. But in any case, we did invest in a few companies. It was only about 20 million or something.
Okay.
And we did invest in a few companies that were interesting and went on, but I found that it wasn't something that I wanted to do. There was a guy up in Rochester that we knew that had been a banker and retired, and he was interested in getting into venture capital, and he came down and he said he wanted to buy this thing. We had a number of investments by that time, and he wanted to buy it. And Saul was not feeling well. He died a little while later. And so we said, let's do it. So we sold it off. But in the meantime, I had been out at, I had bought this house in the 70s in the right near Stony Brook University, gotten very involved in the community and in Stony Brook. And they had put up in the 70s, they had put up a building for new companies.
Yes.
A number of new companies. The place was full from day one.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, the guy who ran the biology department was really a go-getter, very good. He eventually ended up in Utah and. Working in development. And it was very interesting, and they asked a lot of the people around who had been in technology to help these groups of people if they needed it. And most of them came in there like I did, without knowing anything about business.
Yeah.
Couldn't read a financial page. So they suggested that some of them come over to talk to me if they needed help, and some of them did. So I started helping some of them, and as I said, some of them turned out eventually to be more and more in life sciences, which was not a field I knew.
Yeah.
But I knew Kathy Mullinex. Kathy Mullinex was this good friend of mine who had run a drug company for a long time and who had raised $200 million.
Yes, okay.
Well, she had been very successful until, again, the market fell apart in 2001.
Right.
I mean, she started in the 80s, much later than I did. And she's much younger. She's 20 years younger, more than 20 years younger than I am.
Okay.
So she really was building at a much higher. She had 150 research people.
Oh my goodness!
In her company,
okay.
And I said very high, and they made money and so on. They did a very fine job, and they eventually, and then this company was eventually bought in 2001, and so I started suggesting that she talk to some of these people, and she's still a consultant to many of them. In the meantime, between the VC company, which had companies, between the group of people that had started biotechnology companies I told you about, with Sol Mamba, the first one in Seattle,
right.
The Rituxan one, but they had other companies. DNAP was a company that was using DNA technology in plants. It was a San Francisco company. I was on the board of that.
Okay.
And so on, and I started to get on a lot of boards. What happened also was that in 1976, that article got into Business Week.
Right.
And I got a call from a headhunter asking if I wanted to be if I would be on the board of Cigna. Well, it was called Connecticut General
Okay, but it turned
the
into
medical,
something.
the insurance company.
Yes, yes, of course.
And I said, you know, sure. I mean, that had a salary.
Yes,
when you're on the
they
board of
paid
a venture
you.
capital, you're giving them your time, and don't have a salary.
Right, exactly.
So I got on that board, and then I was asked to, by the head of the military company in Long Island, and this
Grumman?
is Grumman. Thank you.
Yes.
The president of Grumman asked me to join the board of Coppers. He was on the board of Coppers, and they were looking. Everybody in the 70s was looking for a woman on the board.
Absolutely.
Every one of them.
Absolutely.
And who could they? And they took the wives of people who were presidents of companies. That's what they did. Did you know that?
No.
You cannot imagine the idiocy of what was going on.
Yes.
So they had to find women who had accomplished something.
Yes, who actually
And so
knew
I
something
got-
about business and
And
something.
I had an advantage to some of them that I had a technical background.
Yes.
And they wanted somebody, sometimes definitely, with a technical background. And they were looking for one. And I turned up and gave them both. So,
Yes.
So I got on the board of that. I got on the point of Data Point, if you remember Data Point.
You were on the board of Data Point?
But very late in the game.
Oh,
They were
okay.
already on their way out. I mean,
Oh, so
I got there.
Edelman or whatever had already in quote invested, bought the company. Had Edelman done his thing?
I
Yeah.
think he was the most corrupt man I ever
Of
knew.
course. But he was there? Okay.
I got on the board before he was there.
Okay.
Before he was there with the group that was in.
Oh, I
and-
knew a lot of people there.
And then there were a few. Then he came in and took over, basically took over the company. It must be a year after I got
Yeah.
on the board, something
Yes,
like that.
I knew Ed
But it was
Gestero
already
there, and
What?
Ed Gestero. He did sales for many years. Ed Gestero.
No, I didn't know.
Oh,
I don't
all right.
remember that.
Okay.
I remember the guy who had been the technical guy, but by that, who was very good. But he had left already.
Yes,
And
he
that
was
point,
a brilliant
guy. They made one big mistake
Yes.
that really destroyed them.
Yes.
And I realized as soon as I got there, and I didn't know, there was no way they could get out. They made this proprietary, their system proprietary. They had a beautiful system. It really never went down. It was a great system. Xerox had built a system and that system they made available to anybody for no money.
Ethernet.
And it took over Ethernet, and it took over the
ArcNet
whole.
died.
It took over the whole thing, and it was nowhere near as good as the Data Point
As
system.
ArcNet.
Nowhere near.
Absolutely.
But what they had done was keep it private. So they wouldn't rent it out to anybody. It was
They
proprietary.
wouldn't let other people make chips for it or
Anything.
do anything.
And that turned out to be a disaster.
Yes.
So I think I never knew. I knew the guy because he came to the meetings. I've forgotten his name. The guy who had really been responsible
Yes,
for the
I have,
beautiful, for the design of the system of his
Yes.
systems. But he, I talked to him once about why they hadn't done it, and he said, "Well, it was the marketing people. They thought it would be better that way."
Yeah.
And there was no way they could get out. The Xerox system had just taken. I mean,
We have
one-
his oral history.
yeah.
So in fact, I and my partner went to Florida to get it.
From whom?
The fellow you're talking about,
Oh, really?
whose name I can't remember either.
Nice guy, yeah.
Yeah, very nice guy. Totally self-educated, no college degree.
Really, I didn't know that.
Oh
I
yeah.
didn't know. Well, I only met him on occasion.
Yeah. Okay.
But he was very capable and smart.
He
But
designed he and a kid designed the 8008 architecture, and it still lives today.
Anyway, I was on a lot of other boards too, and I was on a lot of these small company boards.
Okay.
So I just had a good time.
Good.
Enjoyed
Well,
it.
I need to wrap up because I have to pack up too.
Oh, go ahead now. Then you've got 10 minutes.
Yeah, I know. I'm
Well, if
fast.
the guy, can you call the
Yes,
car and
I
ask him
can
to
call
wait?
the car and tell them to wait. I'm absolutely going to do that. But
Where did you
first,
call the car
I
from?
want to say, while we're still recording, thank you, Evelyn, so much for doing this.
It's a pleasure.
Your stories are wonderful, and it's good to have a record about the Redactron, you know, the earliest, you know, full word processor that we know about
And
so
that was
far.
a computer.
And with a computer with a single chip processor on it. So thank you.
Yeah, but you owe me something.
Yes, I'm going to owe you the dates. Right?
Yes.